Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming along to our second inflation seminar. Unfortunately, inflation is actually quite a bit higher this year than it was when we first decided to have a good look at the topic, and considerably higher when we first did a bit of research on it, which is only a couple of years ago. It was just 2.1%. We found then, as we find now, that a lot of the population don't actually understand who measures or who's responsible for various things, which is not surprising. And that does underlie part of what we're concerned with, which is actually public awareness and appreciation of our statistics. However, that awareness has always improved for me when I hear from people who know a lot more about it than I do, and I'm pleased to say that we've got a number of eminent speakers this afternoon to guide us through one or two of the points. So, without any further ado, in fact, I say thank you very much. I've said before, but say it again, if anyone wants a cup of coffee, etc., please try to pick one up as we move from one speaker to another, rather than during speeches. But we're not going to have any specific break for that purpose. Just do as you will, when you will, okay? And it's now my privilege, if we have the next slide, please, to present our first keynote speaker, Frances Coppola. Very, very pleased to have Frances here today, well-known author and economist, with an interesting background. She does sing as well, which we might have need of if everybody else sends us to sleep later. So without saying anything further, can I welcome Frances?
I found that I like charts. I'm sure you've all seen lots and lots and lots of charts, and you'll see lots of charts this afternoon. So I thought I would speak without charts, because actually what I'm going to talk about is not all that chart friendly, as I think will become apparent. As I'm talking about the persistence of inflation, now a few people have attempted to do this recently, most notably perhaps Hugh Pill, the chief economist of the Bank of England, who cheerfully said in remarks recently that we are all poorer, to which the response was roughly, but you're not, are you? It didn't go down too well. And yet, what he said was actually right. The problem is how you explain it, and I don't think that it came across too well. I want to frame it a little differently from the way he did. It's very easy to frame this in terms of trade shocks and wage price spirals and all those good things that we all know about from economics. But I actually want to take a step back and frame this in terms of a loss, because that's actually what underlies all of this, is a loss, a real loss. The brutal shocks of the last couple of years and the short-run effects of leaving the European Union as well have made us collectively poorer and our economy smaller. Externally, this shows itself as worsening terms of trade. We pay more, much more, for our imports, but we don't receive more for our exports. And as Hugh Pill said, it doesn't take an economist to work out that if you're paying more and you're not receiving more in income, you're poorer. And that is the lived experience now of a lot of people in this country, because domestically, a worsening terms of trade like that shows itself as high inflation, eroding the real incomes of households and this might surprise some people, the real profits of businesses. Now, I know that some businesses have had record profits, but when you look at businesses across the piece, inflation affects their profits too. So even if they're actually turning a profit, the real value of that profit is eroded. Inflation is the symptom of the real loss we have suffered. But terms of trade shocks are transient. Supply chains heal. Energy prices come down. Food prices eventually fall. So why is inflation persistent? I argue that the reason inflation is persistent is not the inflationary shocks themselves, but the response of households, firms, and governments to those shocks. And I root my arguments not really in conventional economic theory about wage price spirals and so forth, or even in monetarism. You know, the Milton Friedman inflation is always and everywhere, a monetary phenomenon, etc., and therefore we can all blame the Bank of England. Though many of you possibly know that my thinking often is monetarist. On this occasion, I want to take a step back and look at what we are all responding to, because I don't think it's the inflation itself. I think it's the real loss. The real loss we have suffered is not merely financial. It is also personal, social, and national. In many ways, it's challenged how we see ourselves and our place in the world. We've had 30 years of price stability. Half the population has no memory of high inflation. Fewer than half remember the ignominy of runaway inflation and the approach to the IMF after the oil price shock of 1973. And younger people have never experienced what we oldies think of as normal interest rates, which, despite recent rises, is actually all our current interest rates are. To young people, near zero interest rates are normal. So for many people, today's inflation and interest rates feel a bit like the rug's been pulled out from under their feet. The prosperity they had hoped for and believed they would have is gone, and they face a poorer, meaner future. The natural response to loss is grief. We are collectively grieving for the loss of our prosperity and maybe also our standing in the world. But the way we express our grief is inflationary. Instead of alleviating our loss, it makes it worse. Consider the well-documented and well-known 5 stages of grief. I'm sure you all know them: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. We look at each in turn. In denial, we refuse to accept that the loss is real. In this case, that we are collectively poorer, and that the loss is permanent and unavoidable. The Bank of England was in denial when it insisted inflation was transient. Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng were in denial when they produced an inflationary budget last September. And households and firms are in denial when they demand total compensation for the loss they are suffering. Households pay demands and/or demands for government support. I've been struck by the way in which often the demands for compensation in this round of inflation have been people turning to the government. I wonder whether the pandemic has actually set a precedent for that. And firms' refusal to accept taxation and/or demanding subsidies and bailouts. Anger. Think of the reaction to Hugh Pill's remarks. You're all right, aren't you? We're all looking for someone to blame. We're angry about firms' excessive profits. Some people are angry about strikes. Some people are angry at minorities. Quite a lot of people are angry about the Bank of England and its monetary policy. Some people are angry with the government. Some people are angry with Putin, with lockdowns, with China. Everyone's looking for somebody to blame, and that is actually typical in a grieving process, that we don't want to accept that we're all part of this, that we want to find someone to blame, somebody to be angry with. And angry's right, angry's fine, but it's not fine if by being angry and flexing our muscles, we force policymakers particularly to do things that make inflation worse. Third stage is bargaining. And it's worth remembering that all of these things are not necessarily sequential. They can all happen at the same time with different sets of people or even the same people in their heads. Bargaining goes things like, if you compensate us for inflation, we will work harder. Yeah, we need more productivity. if you let us raise prices or you refrain from taxing our profits, we will invest. Yeah, we need more investment. Absolutely. These, in the long run, are what will bring back our prosperity. But they shouldn't be used as bargaining counters. The loss is real and unavoidable. Someone has to bear it. If you succeed in bargaining away your part of it, it will fall on someone weaker than you. Denial and bargaining, I think you can probably see, are inflationary. Denial because if you think it's transient, then you will try and look through the inflationary shock and you will perhaps cast monetary policy and fiscal policy in such a way that you assume inflation is going to dissipate and you can go for growth, for prosperity. You can do all the things you were doing before. You don't need to recognise the loss. And bargaining can also be inflationary because if everybody is trying to bargain away their share of the loss, if everybody is fully compensated for inflation, then inflation becomes embedded. This is the classic wage price spiral that we know about. And when the government is involved, there is also the pressure on the government to fully compensate for inflation all the time, which ultimately, as I'm sure you're aware, is felt externally in the collapse of the currency. This is how hyperinflations start. We don't want to go there. I'd also rather we didn't go to depression. But if we keep compensating for inflation, that is actually where we'll end up. Because when inflation becomes embedded, becomes persistent, the real loss gets ever bigger, to a point where you can sink into a depression, properly cast, a long-running slump, while you still have high inflation. We call that stagflation. And it's also worth remembering that we already have depression at the personal level. We already have people who are suffering because of this shock, because of the real loss that we've all experienced. We are seeing health problems. We are going to see worsening mental health and things like that as well. And that should be borne in mind when we have the conversation that we need to have about who should bear this loss. Some of us already accept that we've suffered a loss, especially those relatively insulated from it. It's very much easier to accept that you've suffered a loss, that we collectively have suffered a loss, if you personally haven't suffered much of a loss. But accepting we've suffered a real, unavoidable loss is a better place from which to bargain. We need to hold a conversation about how to distribute this loss equitably and in a way that fosters recovery. And we can't have that conversation while we are denying the loss is real, or looking for someone to blame, or trying to avoid our share of the loss. Right now, we're not really having this conversation. We've kind of left it to the Bank of England to deal with inflation. Monetary policy is doing all the heavy lifting. But monetary policy, though it has distributional effects, is not capable of effecting a fair distribution of gains or losses. Right now, the distributional effects of monetary policy are falling predominantly on kind of the middle to lower end of the income distribution through higher interest rates on mortgages and particularly through rising rents as landlords pass on mortgage rate increases to tenants. This is a distributional effect of monetary policy that is perhaps not falling where is best for the economy, for society, or even for our prospects of recovery. My argument is that when we are talking about distribution, we are in the world of fiscal policy, not monetary policy. It's not monetary policymakers' job to decide where the effects should fall. Monetary policy gets in all the corners. It's intended to. It's the fiscal authority's job, the elected authority's job, to decide how this loss, which is real and unavoidable, should be borne, and how we set ourselves up for the future so that in the future, in the medium term, we can recover. So I say that policymakers are treating inflation as a cause, not a symptom, and failing to address the distributional challenge that the real loss underpinning today's inflation creates. Despite my generally monetarist view of this world, ending the persistence of inflation requires fiscal action. Thank you.
Thank you, Frances. That's a lovely introduction to our day, or our afternoon rather. Do you want to answer, have any questions? Are there any specific questions? Sorry? No, don't worry. I know the feeling.
Just glad to escape.
No?
Okay, thanks, Frankie. If I could ask a brief question, Francis, and thank you very much for the keynote. I'm old enough to remember inflation when it was on the front page of an ordinary newspaper. Is the narrative about inflation, does it have to move from the Financial Times and Rational to the Sun and Emotional to get civil society talking about who wins, who loses?
I think that's a very fair point. That in a way that relates to what I've been saying about everybody. We've successfully, really, since about 1992, made monetary policy the job of central banks. So if inflation hits the tabloid front pages at all, it tends to be the Bank of England isn't doing its job. Can we have a new governor, please? But it seems to me that a lot of what the tabloids are doing at the moment is more of the blame game, really. So who can we find to blame and who can we find to hit to take the losses that the rest of us don't want to suffer? And that's not a very healthy place to be. It would be better, actually, if we could have a discussion in the press generally about the loss, rather than saying inflation. Can we talk about the loss? And the fact that we actually have suffered a real loss, and we need to have a conversation about who bears that loss, because if we don't, then the weakest will bear it, because that's how inflation works, and that's also ultimately how monetary policy works as well.
Very good observation, thank you. Yes, Vicky?
Hi, Francis, you said that people are behaving irrationally or something like that by asking wages to cover their the inflation that they're experiencing, which is strange. I mean, you would imagine this precisely what people should be doing individually, rather than necessarily thinking about the wider good, particularly if they're seeing that there is a part of society that's doing really well from inflation, and they're not. So, and I would actually say that a lot of that inflation and the paying the cost is now in all the other newspapers, not just the FT. And it's a constant discussion item on radio, talking shows, that sort of stuff. But there used to be some concept we all learned at the University of Economics called money illusion.
Yeah.
Which is saying that people would probably be quite satisfied to just get more money rather than, without realizing that actually the value of what they're getting as a wage increase is reducing. So it's now gone out of the window completely because of social media, perhaps because of, in fact, more coverage of what all this is in the newspapers. And the final quick thing is, you're quite right on the fiscal side. There is a way of keeping inflation down, not just what the monetary authorities are doing, which is takes forever to have an impact, since a lot of what's seen out international, but by just putting price controls on things. By lowering or having sort of free transport, as they do in Germany, by really keeping the electricity price thing is one of those. So is that sort of the way that we should be doing, rather than even if the Bank of England raise rates, which seem not to have an impact?
Yeah, a lot to unpick there. Actually, the first is this whole question of rationality. I don't regard the grieving process over a loss as irrational. I think it is a natural response, and I'm not very into this. Sort of natural responses are irrational. It is perfectly rational to say it isn't fair. I didn't cause this. It isn't my fault, and I don't see why I should pay for it. It's a totally rational and reasonable reaction. It isn't fair, and as my mother used to say, well, life isn't fair. The irrationality is actually that life isn't fair, not that we expect that it should be fair, and that those who are responsible for something should pay for that. But that's not where we are, unfortunately. We are, in a way, an irrational loss to which, when we respond rationally by saying it's not fair, I shouldn't have to pay for this, we actually end up with an irrational response to it collectively. Because if we all respond like that, then we simply embed inflation and we make the loss worse. And I think this kind of sort of rationality thing, it's very easy to get lost in what is rational and what isn't. And I actually find that sort of, so I didn't wish to imply that it wasn't rational. It was more that, in a way, the whole thing is irrational. And by trying to be rational, we kind of make it worse.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Let's set
There
this up.
were a few other things. There were,
The value illusion thing, the fact that Mr. Sutton took on the
oh, the money illusion. Now, I think this is important because actually there was a money illusion thread running through what I was saying, really, which is that when everybody wants to be compensated for inflation by raising their nominal wages or raising their nominal benefits, remember I said that people have increasingly turned to the governments for support this time round, and firms respond to that by raising prices, or the increase in government borrowing or whatever means that the current value of the currency collapses and your imports become even more expensive. You end up embedding inflation. In other words, the opposite of what you wanted. It doesn't compensate you. It all goes round in a big circle, and you end up asking for yet more support. And that's the money illusion, that people think that by raising their nominal wages or their nominal profits in the case of firms, they can compensate for a real terms loss. And no, they can't. That real terms loss is real. It is persistent and it's unavoidable. And that's really, I think, where the money illusion is not, you can't compensate for that in nominal terms by, creating money and spending it or whatever. It's not possible to do so.
Thank you. Thank you. That's interesting to me. That sets us up very well for the debate later. Is it really a fiscal solution we need? I think possibly yes. Thank you very much, Frances.
Pleasure.
It's now my pleasure to introduce our first topic, the outlook for inflation, which we have two speakers, Steve Farrington, the Chief of Staff of the Office of Budget Responsibility. Steve kindly returns a year later to explain why our forecasts from the office were slightly wrong last year. I'm very admiring of him wishing to do that. And please, no rotten tomatoes. And then we will have Kay Nuffield from the head of the Forecasting Centre for Economics and Business Research. But if I can give way firstly to Steve. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tony. There was a very generous use of the word slightly, which I will explain. So as Tony said, I'm very pleased to be invited back, having spoken last year and presented our forecast. And to, I should say that the title for this presentation, How Good Are Our Forecasts, was Tony's suggestion. But I was very happy to accept it because it seems fair enough. We are the government's official forecasters, and it is, after all, what we are paid to do. And our forecasts underpin the government's decision-making and policy choices. And with that responsibility comes a great deal of accountability for us to explain how we reach the judgments that we have done. And I think it also gets at the heart of the nature of forecasting and the importance of the transparency and accountability that we bring to the forecasting process, because it's a trivial truism to remark that all forecasts are wrong. But that doesn't mean they're valueless. They're very important, and any government or indeed any individual that's making any policy decision or choice is either implicitly or explicitly doing it with a view to the future and how to influence the future. And I think the way in which we set out our forecasts in as much detail as possible allows them to be contested and for people to reach different views, and it places responsibility on us to explain why we got things wrong and what we're going to try and do to improve things in the future. So with that slight mea culpa out of the way, here come the charts. If I can move on, here we go. So how have we done? How have we fared? Well, let me take you back to our March 2021 forecast for CPI inflation. Now, even if you didn't know how the story unfolded from here, the y-axis would be a very big clue about what is coming next. At the point at which we made this forecast, the economy was just emerging from the pandemic, but the incipient inflation pressures were yet to emerge. Next slide, please. Okay, we moved a couple, but you've got the story. So for by our October 2021 forecast, the economy was emerging from a lockdown, and at that point, there was a post-pandemic surge in global demand, potentially fueled by fiscal and monetary policy responses, which was coming up against some global supply bottleneck pressures, which have long since been forgotten, but were much the talk of the policy debate at the time. And that meant that we had a forecast for CPI inflation rising above 4%, even back then, even before the subsequent rise in energy prices, which of course arrived at the start of 2022. And we closed our March 2022 forecast shortly after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, at which point there'd been an immediate spike in energy prices. But quite how things were going to play out was unknown. But what was clear was that was going to pass through very quickly and unavoidably into inflation. And we were expecting a very sharp downturn, but that sort of fallback in inflation in 2023 was largely predicated on financial markets' expectations at the time that energy prices would collapse back to close to their pre-invasion levels in the first half of 2023. So that was driving that assumption. Next slide, please. But you can see that we still hadn't quite caught up with things. So by November 2022, energy prices had risen even higher, and they were expected to remain higher for a longer period of time, largely because by this point, Russia had effectively switched off the supply of gas to the rest of Europe. Next slide, please. And then just to bring us up to date, we can see that inflation has peaked, we think, round about where we are now. And the question now largely turns to the extent to which we might well be right or otherwise about the pace of the decline in inflation from this point forward. Next slide, please. So the answer to that question depends on the extent to which what was initially very largely imported inflation passes through into the rest of the economy and domestic price pressures. Now, this is a chart that I showed last year, which decomposes what was our March 2022 forecast into what you can think of different groups of the CPI basket and how sensitive and exposed they are to that global energy increase. And you can see that the energy price shock feeds its way into UK inflation in a few stages. Firstly, most directly and immediately via the impact of high oil prices on the price of petrol. That comes through in the yellow bars of fuel. Also directly, but with a bit of a lag, the impact of high gas prices feeding through into domestic energy bills, and that lag comes from the delay to the update of the Ofgem price cap, which we're now all too familiar with. Those are the blue bars, and you can see are a significant contribution to the expected rise in inflation. But then also indirectly, via higher prices for goods and services, raising businesses' costs, particularly those that use energy in their production, and that comes through in the green and the red bars, which represent sectors that are either more or less exposed to the global economy. So the picture, as we saw it back then, was one of largely important inflationary pressures driven by global commodity price increases, but layered onto a small increase in domestically generated price pressures as I say, cruelly proxied by the green and red bars here. So the question arises, which part of this did we get wrong? Yeah, next slide, please. So this chart basically looks at the errors that we made in our overall inflation forecast decomposed into those contributions. So for example, we start on the left with our March 2021 forecast. Which, as you can see, was a very large underestimate of over 7 percentage points. And unsurprisingly, given the size of the underestimate, it was driven by a mixture of domestic and imported inflationary pressures. Moving through to October 2021, we were as I said earlier, we were beginning to catch up to the story on inflation. But perhaps most interestingly, our March 2022 forecast, which I showed you on the previous slide, what elements of that picture did we get wrong? Well, it wasn't really actually the utilities and fuels elements. It was the pass-through into the domestic economy, cost pressures and wages. So that's why the red, purple, and green bars are elevated here relative to the yellow and blue ones. Next slide, please. What conclusions am I inviting you to draw from this discussion of and cancer through our inflation forecasts, other than to perhaps spark a flicker of pity or empathy? And that is I think it really emphasises the degree of uncertainty that exists around any central forecast, which, as I said, is not a novel insight, but we spend considerable amount of time in our slightly too long reports writing a lot about the uncertainties around our central forecast. And we use a battery of techniques to do that, including fan charts, which are very familiar from the bank, having published them for some time. And this is our own example for CPI inflation that shows that one estimate of the range of probabilities of the outlook for inflation from this point forward. But actually, the most revealing part of this slide isn't so much the fan chart, but the fact that I felt the need to include the exhortation "try" in the title of the slide. Because we really do have to try and emphasise. It is remarkable how little discussion there is, despite the content of reports, around the range of risks that we highlight for the forecast, and much more focus on the central forecast and the central outlook that we present. That, to some extent, is understandable, given it drives the Chancellor's decision-making at the margin on individual policies. But if you're really stepping back and thinking about the forecast, you should engage at least as much with the material that we put in here around the range of uncertainty, and policymakers and decision makers should take into account, I think, the range and source of uncertainty around the forecast. Next slide, please. And of course, I couldn't do anything other than conclude by pointing out that we were far from alone in underestimating the increase in inflation. It's a difficult business. So this chart shows on the left-hand panel the range of forecasts for CPI inflation in 2021, and in the right-hand panel the range of forecasts for CPI inflation in 2022. And note again the axes on the numbers on the y-axis. And you can see the black line shows that the average of the increase of independent forecasts, and so all of the forecasts that are out there in the city, with the blue and the red dots showing our forecast and the Bank of England's forecasts gradually following the trend upwards, and the spread of forecasts available depicted by the orange swathe here. But you can see the grey dotted line shows the actual outcome for inflation. And even within the range of forecasters, they were very, very long way away from getting the right answer, only moved towards it very gradually. So there were very few people out there who, or indeed anyone really, within this grouping who had the foresight to see the global energy shock coming perfectly reasonably, I would argue. But it comes back to the point I made earlier at the start about the imperative that places on all of us about the transparency and accountability of what we do and how we present our forecasts. And let me just leave you with my conclusions. Next slide, please. Which, as I say, explain how good our forecasts have been, which, as I say, I've seen worse, but mistakes were made. And they were to initially not see the impact of energy costs coming from the invasion of Russia, which I think is probably forgivable. What I think is more challenging for us is whether and why our models and thinking were slow to calibrate correctly to the speed and persistence with which that globally imported inflation passed through into the domestic economy. And that's where we are now focusing our efforts to make sure we try and understand that dynamic much more, to see if we can do a better job of forecasting what will hopefully be a decline in inflation from this point forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Becky, go straight on with Kay's talk, if we may, and then we'll have a few questions based upon both. That's certainly got one for you, at least. Kay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, Tony. Next slide, please. I just want to go through two things, really, in this afternoon. One is a bit of a different explanation for the background. Why are we seeing the inflation that we're seeing at the moment? Sellers inflation, something that we see increasingly being spoken about in the press, also called greedflation. So we're going to give a bit of background onto that and whether or not it might apply in the UK context. And then we're going to discuss the CEBR outlook for inflation and our forecasts. Next slide, please. So different schools of economic thought, of course, have different explanations for why inflation occurs. The predominant view probably used by most central banks at the moment is a new Keynesian model, basically saying that aggregate demand exceeds aggregate supply, therefore prices rise in an economy. It also accounts for things like inflation expectations and cost push shocks. We have monetary economics as well, and Francis here as a proponent, basically saying that inflation occurs when there's too much money chasing too few goods. Again, here, I think if we look back at the statistics of of money aggregates and the creation and inflation in those, there is an argument there that this might very well have something to do with inflation. And now we have also this kind of relatively new concept of sellers inflation, which basically says that rather than it being driven by a lack of or like a surplus of demand from the consumer side or from the labor side, actually what is driving inflation is firms trying to protect or even increase their profit margins, and that this is made possible during sector-wide cost shocks and supply bottlenecks that gives firms temporary market power. Next slide, please. And just to be clear, I don't think there's perhaps one golden bullet that explains all of inflation going forward. There might very well be several inflations at play at the same time here. However, I think the sellers inflation hypothesis gives quite interesting applications in the current bout of inflation that we're seeing. It's not an entirely new phenomenon or theory, let's say. There was an economist, Abba Lerner, who kind of came up with that concept in 1958, and it was recently popularized by a German economist, Isabella Weber, who is a researcher at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst in the US. And basically, what we're seeing or what we saw in the developed world globally more generally is that we did have these sector-wide cost increases in important upstream industries. If you think about what happened to semiconductors, international freight, how expensive it got to carry and transport things from one end of the world to the other during COVID, and then of course the energy price shock. We've also seen a spike in corporate profits, and we'll go on to the evidence in a little while. And we've also seen that inflation remained elevated for a good period of time, and we haven't seen all too much evidence of excess aggregate demand or a wage price spiral, at least not until recently. Yesterday, Andrew Bailey made a mention of it, but I think that's more of a recent phenomenon. Next, please. So to just recap quickly the theoretical framework, the idea behind it, how can sellers inflation occur? It occurs when we have these supply shocks or bottlenecks in systemically important upstream industries. If you think about the COVID lockdowns, it's quite clear that that's what happened. We had to shut down production of certain things. We had to drastically reduce transport of goods. And then a year later, you had the supply shock following the war in Ukraine in terms of energy prices. And that's the impulse stage, really, that gives the impulse into the system. Then firms react. Firms react by protecting their profit margins as input costs increase. And they're able to do that because due to the shock, they enjoy temporary market power. That means in a normal competitive economy, firms that increase prices are being, they lose market share, their competitors take up the market share, consumers choose a different firm, but in a, let's say, coordinated shock that kind of affects everyone, it is much easier to get away, let's say, with the price increase because, and also your competitors are affected by this price increase, and your consumers read it every day in the news that we have supply chain disruption, that we have bottlenecks, that we're in a crisis, so they're kind of okay with accepting these higher costs. That is the propagation and amplification stage. And then what happens next is what Francis talked about. It's the conflict stage. Workers are trying to recoup losses in real wages. We see industrial action that could then potentially spiral into a wage, lead to a wage price spiral. We might see another shock. So if you consider COVID and Ukraine as two consecutive supply side shocks, these shocks are overlapping, and inflation continues to accelerate. Now onto the evidence in the paper that the authors presented. They show quite clearly that profits in the US surged quite considerably. So the graph here shows how much of the inflation, and inflation is here approximated by nominal growth in US GVA, gross value added, how much of that can be attributed to an increase in profits or an increase in wages. Profits being the reddish color and wages the bluish color. And you see that the 3 quarters of 2021, almost all of the inflation was driven by an increase in profits. Moreover, what the authors also do is they actually looked at the transcripts of earnings calls from big corporates in the US that sit relatively high in the supply chain. So big chemical companies, DuPont, Chevron, but also in the food supply chain, PepsiCo, for example. And they did notice that execs of the company would say things like, in the current environment of crisis, we can get away with increasing prices. Our consumers are willing to accept that because we are in this crisis, and they just have to basically live with it. This is how the crisis basically provided the legitimacy in the context of the past 2 years. Next slide, please. If we look at the UK, so this is the graph showing GDP by income category. So we have wages and salaries in the light blue bars and total gross operating surplus as approximating corporate profits in the dark blue bars. The UK, if you look at the graph until late 2022, has really not seen a big increase in corporate profits. But then in the last quarter of 2022, in the first quarter of this year, and this is showing annual growth rates, you see kind of corporate profits have really skyrocketed. So this could, it's still early days, but this could be a hint that this is also happening in the UK. And I guess if you see the headlines of recent in terms of record profits by oil and gas companies, but also by other companies, Unilever, in different stages of the supply chain, that is perhaps not surprising. And I guess more and more the story is turning towards food price inflation at the moment. I think the government has already instituted a committee looking into food supply chains, looking why, if the raw ingredients, the agricultural products are falling in price, why is food price inflation still so high at nearly 20%? I've been to Italy last week. The same thing is happening there. They have a massive pasta crisis. So the government has convened a pasta emergency committee because pasta prices increased by 20%, even though wheat prices released by 30%. So it is a thing that you see also in other countries. There seems to be profit taking that is really a bit detached from input prices. Next slide, please. And then the question is really, what should the policy response look like? And if you think, well, at the current moment, perhaps the best thing is actually not to do anything, because we spoke about the political kind of sensitivity around it. People are aware of greedflation, and so there's an argument that sooner or later corporates will recognize that, let's say the reasons of war in Ukraine, of COVID, might no longer be so convincing, and sooner or later they will have to reduce their prices. And just one quote that I found from the journalist Marin Somerset-Webb, she said, "Bolstering margins work just fine when greedflation was only discussed in the odd broker's note. It works less well when it has its own hashtag and is trending on Twitter." So there might be something to that you can't go on with that forever. But in the interim, what are we left with? Well, normally we kind of combat high inflation with higher interest rates and with tighter monetary policy. And of course, if you make borrowing more expensive, if unemployment rises, if wages rise more slowly or fall, of course, this will sooner or later lead to a reduction in inflation. But it's a very costly way of getting inflation down. And perhaps if the diagnosis of the reasons for inflation is not correct, that we have excess demand, let's say, then perhaps there are also other policies that might be more suited to bring inflation down rather than the traditional monetary policy tools. It is relatively complicated, though, to kind of act with these policy levers, because they would need to act at the firm level. We would need stricter regulation. Vicky already mentioned price controls potentially, something that we've also seen in terms of the energy price controls in various European countries. You can have windfall taxes to redistribute excess profits from these firms back to the taxpayers. But of course, there's always a risk tinkering with the tax system to get undesirable side effects. You increase more bureaucracy, more complexity to the system. So it's not very straightforward. And lastly, I think another thing that was mentioned also in the paper was that you can also create strategic reserves of the important input materials that you might need. The US Strategic Petroleum Reserve comes to mind, which has played a role in mitigating price volatility, natural gas reserves across Europe as well. And if you're Canadian, you will know that Canada has a strategic maple syrup reserve. So perhaps we should all be a little bit more Canadian and think what key strategic input materials we need a reserve of for the next price shock. Next two slides, actually, because we're going to jump right into the outlook for inflation, just conscious of time a little bit here. So here we see the forecast from the Bank of England, the monetary policy reports from February and May, and in red, the CEBR forecasts. So the Bank of England, of course, has become less, let's say, optimistic about bringing inflation back to its 2% target. In the latest report, this is now predicted to happen about a year later. We're not too far away from the Bank of England in that assessment. I think what for us is different in our outlook is really the medium to longer term outlook for inflation. We have inflation actually hovering between 2% and 3% for the entirety of the forecast horizon, rather than falling down to 2 or even below 2%. What are the reasons for this assessment? Next slide, please. Well, we're looking at core inflation. So it's already been mentioned that the domestic price pressures have been underestimated in the past through two domestic price pressures. So core inflation, which strips out energy and food prices, is very high. It's trending sidewards, not downwards. And we think that this is really adding to the probability that inflation is going to stay high. We also think that elevated inflation expectations will play a role in keeping pay growth at elevated levels above 5%, given that the labor market has also remained relatively tight with only marginal loosening really so far. And then I think also that, looking back, I have to admit, I'm one of those that don't know inflation, except from textbooks until last year, or 2021. But looking at these textbooks, it seems that it takes quite a while to get inflation back down to 2% once it's reached these very high levels. And I think it's just something in people's minds and their psychology that if you kind of have 2 years of inflation of, above 6, 7, 8%, it takes a while for the price mechanism in the economy to reset. We could be wrong, of course. It could be that for a credit squeeze in the economy, either or due to the tighter monetary policy, but also potentially due to the turmoil in the banking sector, with banks being less or being more stringent in their lending criteria. Could be that leads to a more pronounced economic slowdown. It could be that unemployment increases faster than we thought, and that would help to push inflation down. Our inflation outlook, likewise, broken down by a category here. Just to reiterate those, if you focus perhaps on 3 colors, yellow is food and alcoholic beverages. I combined those. Red is mostly utilities, and purple and blue is the services sector, broadly speaking. And what you see that, of course, utilities' contribution to inflation is getting smaller and even slightly negative from the middle of this year onwards. But we do have still considerable food inflation, and we do forecast that will slow, but it won't turn negative. We also have in the UK an upwriting in excise duty, for example, which will probably be passed on to consumers. And the other main component that keeps inflation above the 2% level for us is really the domestic inflationary pressures that are represented here by the purple and blue lines in the services sector. So that's just to complete our outlook. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dave. You just join them momentarily. Any questions for our 2 excellent speakers, please? Nasib, yes.
Two questions. So one is Brexit not a factor at all? Neither of you mentioned it. Is that not a factor at all in inflation? And the second question is that, so when inflation does come down, does that mean that businesses, producers are actually lowering their prices? Is that what some of the inflation you find in retail, a lot of people are too slightly more questions?
Yeah, Brexit kind of affects everything, but also nothing really in terms of inflation. So it certainly increases frictions in terms of trade. I think it was most clear in that episode where there was a shortage of produce, which was more freely traded across the continent. But I think firms were quite reluctant to engage with the additional bureaucracy of getting produce to the UK. So that could have been a contributor to food price inflation in those months. However, in the grander scheme of things, energy prices, profit margins, these are affecting the UK, the Eurozone, the US to a certain degree as well, and I would say relatively independent of Brexit.
Yeah, I agree with that. Brexit is is more of a slowdown on the supply side of the UK economy at the moment, and through the next few years, at least in our analysis. That does potentially manifest itself, as Kay was saying, in periods where supply might be less responsive to increase in demand, or shocks as we've seen in the supply chain, just notwithstanding this vision otherwise. Hope. On your question of whether prices are now going to fall, sadly no. What's going to happen is prices will probably stay at the elevated level they are now, and inflation will come down because inflation will increase in prices relative to where they were a year ago. And now prices have risen, they will stay elevated, but gradually, they will spend a year at the same time, and annual inflation will therefore come down to close to 2% of that, and prices falling as price increase.
And is that because the baseline gets raised every time we make an assessment?
Yes, for what it's worth, I've taken more interest in inflation in the last couple of years with better statistics than I've ever had in my previous too many years. And one of the things that really has amused and interested me is the RPI inflation was removed because of the failure mathematically that when prices went down, RPI didn't actually take them down as much as it might have done. Purely theoretically, because the examples of prices actually going down are so limited. It doesn't really happen very often.
But prices have come down in various areas, so I don't know why we're saying that they're not going to come down. Petrol prices have come down.
That's
For example, food prices are going to have to come down because this particular price commission or whatever it is there, it's going to happen in Germany, it will happen in other places too. Because it's just unacceptable to have those profits there. So there's no way in which you can reduce those profits unless you do something about those prices. So I would think that we're going to see a little bit of that as well. And I think, as we said, Kai, international food prices have been coming down for the last year, month after month, except for the last month when they stabilised. So at some point, this will have to come through. Clearly, there are costs from earlier that have been passed through now. And then the other thing is if interest rates start coming down. Because, Francis has written quite a lot about how interest rate increases are increasing the cost in businesses and therefore they're passing through some of that cost to the consumer. Then you would imagine that some of that will also have to come through as lower prices at some point, whether there's interest rates coming down. Are we wrong? So this isn't just that inflation, of course, automatically comes down because you're comparing. And look at some countries like Spain, where inflation halved in 1 month. And here we are still struggling. So I think Brexit has to have some impact because our gap seems to be quite substantial between us and the rest of Europe at that point. But they have seen actually inflation because of some prices having gone down considerably, just half just in 1 month in one case.
Just one question, Steve, I have for you, if I may. I was interested to know that the OBR actually does forecast the RPI as well as the CPI. And I'm interested to understand, in your relationship with the government, if it's not telling you no secrets, the degree to which government itself is really interested in the RPI figure compared to the CPI figure, which it seems most people concentrate on CPI as the one the Bank of England uses, etc., etc. But does the government, in its fiscal, take very serious account of RPI?
Only for the purposes of subsets of its policy. So by that I mean government has a choice between how it chooses to obey both benefits and taxes for changes in inflation. For benefits, they typically choose CPI inflation because it is, as the ONS will tell you, the best measure of inflation, or CPIH. But for tax increases, threshold increases, the government chooses RPI, which is typically higher, and that is favourable to the government. And it is sort of inflation indice shopping that can happen when you have multiple indices that have different properties to them, and the government made choices that are perhaps not surprising.
Okay. So thank you very much indeed. It's my pleasure sorry, is there one more question? My apologies, yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm interested in the decomposition of the GDP deflator according to the income measure. And I wondered if it's... I reckon there's a bit of confusion about this. And I noticed in your remarks that you compared Isabella Weber's analysis for the US, but I think you then looked at just the pure income measure components for the UK. But more generally, whether, maybe no, it's a question for the OBR, whether you think it's a useful thing to do. And yeah, it's a robust technique.
Sorry, whether
it's a useful thing to do and whether you consider it's a robust technique.
Sorry, I'm not quite sure whether...
When people decompose the GDP deflator according to the contributions from capital and labour, crudely, which has become prominent recently, but it's not something that falls out of the official stats.
So in general, yes. So I mean, once again, we need to forecast GDP deflator because the government chooses to use it to outrate total envelopes of public spending, which is understandable given that public services are delivered and reflect price across the full spectrum of the economy, and not just ones that are particularly within CPI or RPI baskets. So that's why we're required to forecast it. At the moment, we're not taking a very strong signal from what's happening trends in the GDP deflator and the income side of the GDP whole, because there's, I'm afraid it's annoyingly technical, well, not you'll know this yet, there's a currently wide discrepancy between the different measures of GDP on the expenditure and income measure, which theoretically should all be the same, but we're getting very different signals from them. The income is lowest, which I think is probably due to the fact that the statistics are yet to catch up fully with all of the various subsidies that have been introduced in response to energy prices. I don't think they've been fully incorporated into the income measure. And similarly, there's some issue with the expenditure measure, which is under recording imports. So I think the overall picture on GDP is in the right place, but the read from particular measures are probably misleading.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. It's my pleasure to hand over to the next session, please, for Vicky Price as chair of the next session. Gentlemen, can return to your seats.
This is the topic, which is the cure worse than the disease? And Nick Bates first, please.
So I'm here to talk you through some of the main points from the bank's recent monetary policy report. This session is badged, will the cure be worse than the disease? I'll let you decide on that. But to just note, this is off the record. All charts are from the recent monetary policy report. I'm not on the MPC, so there's no secret insights into the future of monetary policy in what I'm about to say. But let me start with the main points. So CPI inflation has edged down a little bit over the last few months, but we do expect it to fall a bit faster than that over the next few months. That starts in next week's data for April, and then we're expecting further falls to around 7% by the middle of the year. The main driver of that is energy effects, though, rather than a substantial weakening in core inflation. Food price inflation remains higher, closer to 20%. We'll see how that's very similar across other European economies, though, suggesting that common factors are really at play rather than being a UK-specific phenomenon. On the growth side, prospects have strengthened over the last few months. That's taken place alongside wholesale gas prices falling back sharply, the government extending the £2,500 energy price cap for consumers, and a lower outlook for energy bills beyond that. Despite those slightly brighter prospects, though, we still expect growth to be pretty subdued over the next couple of years, remaining well below trend and resulting in some of that slack opening in the economy and the unemployment rate rising moderately. All of this is based on the market path for interest rates, which shows rates rising a little bit further in the near term before easing back to about 3.5% over the medium term. But in due course, we do expect that slack in the economy to bear down on inflation, with the single most likely scenario being that it falls somewhat below 2%. But as we've talked about, and uncertainties, things like that, we think the risks are skewed to the upside if the tight to labour market and high current inflation lead to more persistent wage and price pressures, then inflation could fall back by somewhat less than that. So that's a quick summary. Let me take you through some of the details, and I'll start with activity on the next slide. So the left-hand side here shows market sector output, so GDP excluding the government, which we think is the best measure of really underlying output. As you can see, it's recovered to slightly above pre-COVID levels, but it's really been very flat over the last year or so, so falling below that upward trajectory that it was showing prior to that as we were recovered from COVID. So growth really slowing to a standstill. The right-hand side just focuses on the last 18 months or so. Now, the headline GDP numbers in blue have been very volatile, not least owing to the effects of the additional bank holidays for the Queen's Jubilee and the Queen's funeral. But adjusting for those factors in orange, there have been some signs of an underlying strengthening a little bit since last autumn. I'll come on to some more evidence for that in a minute, but we think underlying growth might have picked up a little bit to around 0.25% per quarter recently, from around 0 through the second half of last year. Those slightly brighter signs in the official data are echoed in near-term indicators such as the PMIs, for example, which is shown on the next chart. You can see they've picked up from where they were in the second half of last year, output expectations in particular in the blue line. Similar improvements have been evident in other countries' PMIs as well, suggesting that some of this strengthening has been more global in nature. The significant falls in global energy prices potentially being one prime candidate for that. If you map these into GDP space, they again suggest that underlying growth has picked up a little bit recently, maybe to around 0.25% or so, or a little bit higher if you take that blue line. So some slightly brighter signs for growth over the last few months. Alongside that, in the next chart, the labour market has also remained firm, though with some gentle signs of easing in places. This chart here shows various indicators of employment growth. So after the surge, as the economy recovered from COVID, they weakened through last year, and come last autumn, were pretty close to 0, and also heading into this year. As with GDP, though, they've also picked up a little bit more recently, and employment data, the official data in orange, has also done the same, with a little bit more strength in the data published earlier this week. So potentially stronger GDP and stronger employment buttressing each other to at least some extent. If you go to the next slide, as I said there have been some signs, early signs of easing in the labour market. Firms' demand for staff has eased, so vacancies on the left-hand side have fallen back, albeit from exceptionally strong levels last summer. Churn in the labour market on the right-hand side, so job-to-job flows, that's also softened a bit as well. Now, both of these indicators tend to move cyclically and have both fallen back somewhat over the last 2 months, although, as you can see, they are coming from pretty exceptionally strong levels. But overall, if you go to the next slide, the labour market remains tight at the moment, with the unemployment rate just below 4%, and we expect it to remain at those levels, around those levels over the next few quarters. Further out, though, as you can see in the chart, we expect it to rise moderately, in part as tighter monetary policy feeds through. And I'll come back to that. Now, that's a quick review of the real side of the economy, but obviously it's inflation getting most of the headlines at the moment. So if you go to the next slide, obviously headline inflation is around 10%, and core inflation is around 6%, clearly both very elevated. Now, we'll come on to some of the factors pushing up on headline inflation particularly sharply in a minute, namely energy and food. But within core inflation, there does seem to be some evidence of second-round effects from higher headline inflation. In particular, wage growth is running at 6 or 7% at the moment, which is notably above where you'd expect it to be on the basis of typical determinants like productivity, the cyclical position of the labour market, and 2% inflation, for example. So that's one of the potential risks I flagged at the start, that higher headline inflation and second-round effects reinforce each other and result in inflation persisting at higher levels for longer. In the near term, though, if you go to the next chart, we do expect at least some better news, and this chart shows our near-term inflation forecasts. So we think inflation may fall to around 7% by the middle of the year, from around 10% today, largely driven by utilities in fuels, so that's orange and green, rather than by core inflation. That's driven by the large rises in petrol and utility prices this time last year, dropping out of the annual comparison. We're expecting inflation in the more domestically orientated sectors, so more like services inflation, to remain elevated in the near term, though, given that low unemployment and some of this pass-through from higher headline inflation. Going back to a couple of things which are pushing up on inflation, particularly sharply at the moment. On the next slide, on the energy side, we are expecting some falls in consumers' utility bills in due course. This chart shows wholesale gas prices, the latest numbers being in pink, and you can see they're down markedly from where they were through last summer. Now, the government has obviously protected consumers and firms from the worst of this. Remember, the Ofgem cap for consumers was ready to go up to around £4,000 last autumn, but the government capped it at £2,000. That cap will end in June though, and on this current profile for wholesale gas prices, we're expecting that to come down to around £2,000 or so, but that's still markedly above where it was a couple of years ago. So that will lower inflation both directly but also indirectly as lower energy costs feed through the supply chain as well. Alongside energy, food on the next slide has been a key area of interest over the last few months, food price inflation touching close to 20% most recently. What this chart shows though is that food prices have gone up sharply in lots of countries. In particular, food inflation in the euro area, so in orange, is very similar to in the UK. The US was running at very strong rates, but that has faded a bit more recently. It generally suggests that global factors, food commodity prices, energy prices, rises in other input costs have been significant drivers of what we're seeing in food price inflation rather than just a UK-specific component. Clearly, that doesn't make higher food prices any easier for many households, though. But based on evidence, if we go to the next slide, from early in the supply chain, so if you go to the look at the right-hand side of this chart, hopefully there's a bit more better evidence. Hopefully food price inflation might be close to a peak. So if you look at food producer prices in orange, they've plateaued most recently, although they're clearly not falling back particularly sharply, but that does hopefully give some grounds to expect food price inflation to start levelling off and then falling back in due course. On the left-hand side, perhaps more positive signs for easing inflationary pressures in other goods components, though. The left-hand side again shows producer prices. In orange, you can see clearly that's fallen back over the last few months, so that gives grounds to expect the blue line to follow in due course as well. So for both energy and non-energy goods, some signs of inflationary pressures easing at earlier parts of the supply chain. If you go to the next slide, in order to get CPI inflation back down to target over the medium term, though, we think a marked tightening in monetary policy has been necessary. As is our custom, the forecasts I'm showing you are based on the market curve for interest rate. So having tightened to 4.5% already, the market's pricing in around another 25 basis point rate rise in the near term, in blue, before falling back to around 3.5% over the medium term. You can see that broadly similar profiles are expected for both the ECB and the Fed, although clearly the precise timings and levels vary somewhat between those different central banks. Now that's clearly a very substantial tightening compared to where we've been for the last 15 years or so. It's also notable that tightening in monetary policy that we've seen over the last 18 months has been quite back-end loaded since the second half of last year. So there's quite a bit of tightening still coming into the system, which if you go to the next slide, one reason for that is that because of changes in the structure of the mortgage market. So more than 80% of the mortgage market is now at fixed rates, compared with only around 30% going back a decade or so when more people were on tracker rates. So it takes time for people to roll off these fixed rate deals onto and refix onto either a new one, a new fixed deal, or a new tracker deal. To demonstrate that, if you go to the next slide, the orange line here shows the average mortgage rate on new lending. So if you take out a new mortgage today, with the light blue line being a standard 2-year fix on a 75% loan-to-value ratio mortgage. As you can see here, they are up at around 4 to 5%, compared with more like 1 to 2% prior to COVID. But the purple line shows the average rate on the outstanding stock of mortgages, i.e. including all the people who are still on fixed rate deals. As you can see, that's only ticked up very modestly in comparison, less than 100 basis points or so. Only a small proportion of people have rolled off their mortgages onto the new, more expensive ones. But as time rolls on, that purple line will converge towards the orange line at a materially higher level, therefore imparting some dampening through mortgage rates. So finally, this shows the overall, if you go to the next slide, please, our overall inflation forecast. In the modal, or the single most likely projection, in the darkest shade of orange, then inflation falls to a little bit above 1% over the medium term, as energy, food effects and second-round effects fade, slack in the economy bears down. But the MPC do think that the risks that are skewed to the materially to the upside, given the risks of the strength of inflation feeding through into more persistence in domestic wages and prices. So under the mean forecast, then inflation is much closer to target at around 2% or so. So to summarise, on the final slide, the MPC have obviously just raised rates to 4.5% to address the risks of persistent strength in wage and prices. Further tightening could be necessary depending on how inflationary pressures develop, but ultimately they will do what's necessary to bring inflation back to target in a sustainable fashion. I'll stop there and either open up to questions or move on to the next one.
Well, first of all, thank you very much. There used to be this quite substantial difference in GDP forecast between the OBR and the MPC, or the Bank of England anyway. And now that seems to have disappeared. I mean, that's number one. Has it made any difference to your inflation outlook? You were more pessimistic on growth, but now you seem to be about the same. Is it to what extent is the growth element of it, does it have any impact on your inflation forecast ahead? Or are we to perhaps assume at the end of the day that those interest rate increases have hardly made any difference? And given that growth is higher than you had anticipated, and inflation actually has stayed higher than you had anticipated anyway. So
is this a question about our growth forecast in absolute context or relative to the OBRs? 'Cause obviously, I mean, we've got quite different assumptions than the OBR. I think they've generally got a bit stronger supply side than us, which isn't inflationary but results in higher GDP over time. I think they also have a bit more of a cyclical strengthening at the back end of the forecast compared to us. On our side, we clearly have revised up the forecast from the February report to the May report. We've seen a bit more strength in the near term. Now, as we go through, one of the things partly contributing to what Steve puts the uncertainties around these forecasts in context. These are all conditional forecasts, and one of the things we condition on is government policy. As I said, the Ofgem cap maybe would have been around £4,000. It's now £2,500. In the February report, I think the cap was supposed to go up to about £3,000, but the government have held it there. So that's a positive for the economy. You've seen further declines of the gas curve. So those kind of things are contributing to the stronger growth outlook. All else equal, does that contribute to higher inflation? Yes, but there's lots of other things going on as well. So the labour market remaining tight as well.
So the interest rate change doesn't really make any difference to the growth forecast that you've got?
It is not the sole determinant of the. I mean, it clearly has a marginal impact depending on where the curve's gone, but there's other things at play as well. So I wouldn't take the growth forecast as purely a read on what interest rates have done, or vice versa.
Right, there's a quick, thank you. There are a few questions. Yes, quickly. Can I take them all? Can I take each? No, not all together. One, but in sequence, and then you'll answer them both. Yes, there, and then Tony. Yeah.
In the questions to you, but also to Steve, is that when you do your forecasting, given that we know that forecasts change with sort of, when you come to sort of real data, do you then model at the time of forecasting the sorts of factors that might change your forecasts? Do you do those exercises?
So I think the bank has at times done scenarios for I can't remember exactly off the top of my head, a different profile for energy prices or something like that. So you can do this scenario analysis to give some idea of the uncertainties around it. Clearly, there's the fan charts as well. I think if we go back, so what the widest range of oranges there is from almost -2 to +5. That's a considerable range, which demonstrates some of the points that Steve was talking about earlier. Firstly, these are conditional forecasts. Lots of other things can happen, but even then, these things are subject to pretty significant uncertainties.
Take one more question, or two more questions quickly, and then we move on to Ian Cass. Yes.
Thank you. Look at those interest rates, by the way. I can remember paying 15.25 on the chart of these rates.
Loads of nodding going on.
One of the things that's been on my mind, and it's hardly been mentioned yet, and I had hoped it would be, Vicky did hint at that prices do come down. But actually, if we're going to see a recovery in purchasing powers, what people really want, then we see some deflationary forecasts not there. Now, if inflation were to go down, still be positive, we still have high prices with which people are still going to be very hard struggling. And one of the real problems is the Prime Minister recently suggested that everybody study mathematics to age 18. This is actually the wrong thing. What we need is to get people numerate at a much earlier age.
So they behave rationally. That's really good. That's what Francis would like. Francis, quickly.
Yeah. I have a question actually about the monetary tightening effect on firms. Because
We'll hear a little bit, I think, probably in the next.
yeah, maybe. Because this kind of monetary tightening is still applying its way through mortgages, but the firms seem to be notably absent from the monetary policy, the effective monetary policy, and I would have expected there to be some impact on firms in terms of being targeted.
Do we want to answer that one at the end of the, if you just keep it at the end of the next one? And there is I think the question, we need to come back, probably the question of deflation, if you like, and the risks of that. If that's, well,
Okay,
we can, you can say something very quickly now so we can move to the next one.
Okay, I'll go quickly. Deflation. If you look at the detail of the CPI basket, there's actually quite a lot of prices tend to fall over time. There's a whole distribution from prices which regularly fall quite significantly, I know IT equipment, stuff like that, and prices which quite rise regularly. So it's not unusual for some particular prices to fall. It's just unusual for the aggregate of them all to fall. This goes back to what Francis talked about earlier. If the economy, say you have a real shock to the economy, you can absorb that at high levels of inflation, you can absorb that at low levels of inflation. The real impact is arguably, all else equal, going to be the same. That's kind of something which monetary policy has to think about. It has lots of other effects as well. And that gets into lots of the debates that we kind of talked about right at the very beginning.
That's great. So we can stop with you, Nick, if you wouldn't mind sitting down, because about, and then get Ian to come. Apologies if you had to wait, but there were some really interesting elements of what we just heard, and we needed to not forget about them.
Absolutely.
And we're running behind time-wise, but that's just too bad.
I'll try and catch us up. Hello, everybody. Nice to see you all again. I can't have done too bad last time you invited me back. That really title doesn't kind of suit this. So let's move on to the next slide, and I'll try and explain to you what I'm going to do. My background, 14 is quite a key number, and there is a reason I'm going through this, so we can just move it on. One was, I was with big business, with ultimately what became Diageo for about 14 years, through a load of changes and Guinness takeovers, those of you long enough in the tooth to remember that. Then I was self-employed, small business. I had 6 businesses that I set up in those 14 years. If you'd looked at me productively in terms of the individual businesses, it might have not looked too good, but Mrs. Cass would assure you that I was very productive myself and never at home while I was doing that. And then the last 10 years, funnily enough, so I reckon I've got 4 years left and then I become unemployable again, was really in helping others, and it's helping really micro businesses predominantly. Something that I've really enjoyed doing. It got its hooks into me. So the Forum of Private Business has about 18,000 small and micro business customers that we look after. The Forum of British Pubs, FBP, that was set up during the pandemic to help pubs in particular. We've got about 800 members of that. And we just set up something fairly recently called the Micro Business Alliance as a result of feeling that micro biz didn't get the support it needed during the pandemic. And the member organisations, we've got about 1.2 million micro businesses that are signed up to that at the moment. Strategy is great, but as the army say, no strategy survives beyond first contact with the enemy. Whatever you think is going to go on, change is inevitable. It kind of amuses me slightly when people talk about stability. When you go into the micro business world, you don't have stability. It doesn't exist. So change is a constant, and once you accept that, then you realise that you've got to keep learning your own skills, keep developing, and keep growing if you're going to keep on top of things. And that's what most micro businesses do. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how inflation is impacting on the micro business sector. But like Francis, this isn't got a load of numbers charts. I'm not a statistician, but we're dealing with micro businesses every day. I can tell you what they're going through. What I'm going to try and do is give you a picture very quickly of the sector, of the people that are in that sector and the behaviour that's going on at the moment, and hopefully you'll find that useful. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. So SME background, if you just bring those up. The sector itself is very, very wide. Too wide, you could argue. The government looked at that small business sector, 0 to 249 employees. Well, 249's got some bloody big businesses in it, and 0 less so. Makes up about 99% of the businesses in the UK economy, so they are important. The next chart is statisticians, so I'll point out the mistake first of all. 1 to 9 employees is actually 75% of the UK economy. If you include 0 employees, it takes it up to 95% of the economy. All I'm trying to say is these micro businesses are very, very significant in our economy. And governments, departments, regulators have always struggled in dealing with this sector, of getting to them, communicating with them effectively. It's always proved a challenge. The one thing I can say to all of you with absolute certainty is small business is not big business, only smaller. And the sooner the Treasury, government and everybody else realises that, the better. What you do that has an impact on a big business, it can be a completely different impact on a micro business and a micro business owner. And we really should be recognising that. Next slide, please. So that's the sector. Right. The people that are going in it, why do they go in it? If we can just bring those. It's passionate individuals. That's what they usually are. All groups, husband and wife, couple of friends, with a shared vision and a passion to do something. Don't kid yourself. Some are in there by design, but some are in there by accident, almost. There are those ambitious people that set up a micro business with a view to scale up and growth and selling it. But there's a hell of a lot of people in there that you would class as unemployable. I deal at Macclesfield College. I'm a governor there, right? We're dealing with kids that, the young girl that really does have some issues, but she designs goth clothing. She's not going to be employed by Barclays or AstraZeneca around near us, but she might be able to set up her own little business. And there's a lot of people in that sector that are there doing things because they love it, and it's not always about scalability or profit. Maybe it's sometimes, that's my little niche, that's what I've found. They lack specialist resources. They do not have the resources of big business. They don't have HR teams. They don't have legal people. So they tend to try it themselves first. It comes to me, I'll see if I can do it. And if I can do it, then I'll carry on doing it. If I can't, I'll have to outsource it or find a friend that can do it for me. By their nature, they're very they are generalists. Pretty much like me, actually. But they are very creative, damn creative, and they'll find a way round things. They'll find a way there. I've said resilient, that robustness comes from that creativity. Time's a huge cost them as well as money. If it's something that's going to take me 2 hours of my day to fill in a piece of bloody regulation and a form, that's a quarter of my day gone when I could be building and developing my business. That's an issue for me. Yeah. They don't differentiate business and personal. A lot of the ones I deal with have got into trouble, particularly financially. They will dip into their own bank accounts and bail out, and they'll do things that would seem irrational to a lot of business people. It makes sense to them, and they don't differentiate between the two. It is their life. Emotion plays a huge part in it. I didn't walk away from big consultancy in Europe that paid me a hell of a lot of money based on financial reasons. It was because my mum was in her 80s, my dad had recently died, I'd missed my little girl pretty much growing up, and I'd got a son, and I wanted to be at home in Knutsford. I didn't want to disappear on a Monday morning and maybe reappear on a Friday night or Saturday sometimes. It wasn't logical. It was emotion that drove it. And there's so many examples of that where they're driven by emotion. They are resilient and they don't play by the usual rules, these people. So we've got the sector, we've got the people. If we can move on again, please. Next slide. The challenges that we face. Whatever we deal with this helpline, we get massive numbers of calls through every day. The pandemic, you can imagine, it went through the roof. Anything from how do I do finance, what's the health and safety around this. When you distill it down, very often, most of these micro businesses ask us for two things. If you dig down deep enough, it says, make it easy for me to do business and give me a level playing field to operate on. And if they get that, they can thrive and survive. I'll give you one example in that. I could give you loads, we haven't got the time. I'll give you one. Everybody's talking about hospitality at the moment. Everybody's talking about pubs, and they lump it into one big group, and the pubs are in trouble. Well, yeah, but if you're a free house pub where you own the pub and you can use the market forces and buy and wheel and deal, you're not too bad. If you are a tied tenant, you're supposed to be your own business owner, yeah, but you are tied into an agreement with a brewer, okay? And very often these aren't brewers anymore. The big six in the UK that run about 9,000 pubs don't brew beer, predominantly. They're owned by property companies. So you pay your rent. Well, most of these agreements are upward only rent agreements. So even if your market, if the market's not doing very well, your rent either stays the same or goes up. It's not going to go down to reflect the trade. So you're knackered on that, basically. The other one is you have to buy everything through them. The tie used to be about making sure that the brewer sold their beer through your pub. Fair enough. Now, everything is included in the tie. The beer, the soft drinks, the wine, the food, your insurance on the premises. All of those you have to buy through that brewer at the price they set. So they're getting two bites at the cherry. So I'm not surprised that parts of the hospitality sector are suffering, but you can see what I mean. If you look, that's just one sector. I could give you examples from a lot of them where micro businesses suffer through that. Next slide, please. So getting into productivity. They didn't look at productivity as a measure before the pandemic. They sure as hell don't now. The pandemic was a tipping point, undoubtedly. If you were complacent in your business, it was the kick up the backside that some needed. A lot of work that weren't going into the digital world have. But there has been a shift there. The question we very often ask is, am I making enough money to sustain the lifestyle I aspire to? And is what I'm doing fulfilling me and congruent with who I am? That's what a lot of them is. Now, that sounds a bit woolly, and it is. But it's not based on normal, you'd say the way business is supposed to operate. The pandemic gave people time to reflect and think, certainly, and many of them did that. So even more are working in this kind of more flexible way. We've seen more people leaving big business and making lifestyle decisions and setting up those little cottage businesses that they wanted to do, be it as a food producer. I mean, I was in the booze trade. Look at the number of micro distilleries out there. If you ever look at the gin market now, pretty much every region of the country's got a small distillery now. So there's lots of people moving into that micro business sector as a choice. Some are doing it to make money. What I was saying is, some are doing jobs to make money until they can restart the passion project. We've got a bit of a survey going on at the moment. I haven't got the numbers back for it yet. But in excess of 60% of the people that we've surveyed so far have more than one role, do more than one thing. Some of them are part of the passion project. They've closed down the high street shop maybe. They're still trading a bit online and they're working for somebody else. It's a means to an end to get some money through the door. And the cost of living has certainly impacted on that, and inflation's had its impact. We've seen a lot of people moving away from premises or into smaller premises, costs of energy, costs of rent. So yeah, it has made a difference in there. Work-life balance and home working, we've all seen the impact of that. It hasn't settled down yet, but there's a lot of people still working from home that are kind of refusing to come back into the office point blank. That has its own issues. Everybody's talking about hybrid working, but there is no legal definition of hybrid working. The casual agreement you had during the pandemic has no legal precedent. You have to rewrite people's contracts if you're going to let them work from home for a period of time. And there's health and safety then around that. You then get loads of micro businesses going, am I still liable if something happens when they're working at home? Well, yeah, you are. You're supposed to check if they've got an effective workspace. I said this before, we had one where there was a lady working at home and she was using her ironing board as a desk and things like that, you know. So there's a whole range of stuff that's been going on as a result of this pandemic. Many of the people coming into the micro business sector are escaping large scaled up businesses. So in terms of looking at them as productivity, they don't want to scale up. They actually want to scale down. And that's why they've done what they've done. There's a lot of community working going on. I said this thing about more than one job role. Not name dropping, but I kind of am. I was invited to the palace for one of the garden parties before the coronation. Very nice it was too. Great afternoon tea. Met 4 micro business owners that I know there. None of those micro business owners were there because of what they do in their core business, if you see what I mean. It was all community projects that they do on the side. And a lot of these people do, you'll find they've got 5, 6, 7 different roles. I've got my roles in business. I'm also the governor on 3 schools and help out in a charity as well. So a lot of these people are involved in the communities there, carrying on different roles and different jobs within there. So try and nail them down to just being the person in that job is very often very difficult because they've got more than one thing going on. The barter system's alive and well. I'll rattle through it. Barter system's alive and well. People are trading their services with each other. They may not be as efficient as they could be, but the fact is they know it and they're happy with that. They're happy with the business they've got. Post-pandemic, things have not even got close to settling down yet. It's still chaos out there and it'll take a while for a lot of these things to fall into place. Next one, please. And that was me on to question and answers. There you go. I wasn't too far off.
No.
Cheers. Thank you very much for listening. I hope it's been useful.
We have a bit of time, very little time for questions. So there's one in the back.
Okay, thanks, mate. I'm doing 2 things at once, like you said. But in my business and in my public life, I'm a price taker. I don't have control over so many prices that hit my business, be it in politics, or the charity sector, or the private sector. Are we in a situation where there is anxiety and frustration because people's ability to be price givers has flown out the window? A small number of major corporations and entities are driving prices, but most of us are literally hostage to the next invoice.
Absolutely. Small Business Commissioner, late payments has gone back up through the roof. So having tried to bring it under control, 30 days, ideally 60 days, 1,900 days is not unusual now that it's gone into. And most micro businesses are scared, A, to report it or B, to do anything about it because they're so reliant on that big customer that they don't want to rock the boat with them. So the simple answer is, yeah, it's a huge issue. The Small Business Commissioner needs more teeth than she's got at the moment, certainly. I would also like to see, we have something called the Prompt Payment Code, which isn't a code at all. It's shambles, as we proved when Carillion went down. And the government should be looking at rewriting that Prompt Payment Code.
For themselves as well.
Well, because they're not following it. When you start taking part, people like Rolls-Royce and Balfour Beatty off, they complain to government. And yeah, so it needs to be a tighter code, especially a voluntary code. And government shouldn't be buying off people that have taken 120 days to pay small suppliers. So that was a bit of a long answer to this, but yeah.
But just so the final thing that I can bring Nick into that as well. I mean, the last slide was about productivity. And of course, as you rightly said, you spend a lot of time trying to fight off these things that reduces your productivity very significantly. And presume that must be taken into account when you're doing your forecast. And the interesting thing related to employment data is that, yes, employment went up by 0.2%. But what you see is that it was more self-employment or possibly part-time work, not payroll employment. Which suggests there's a lot of involuntary movement into that area. And of course, self-employed generally tend to be less productive, whether we like it or not, because they spend all the time doing other things and they don't get paid necessarily per hour that they actually spend. So is that a consideration at all, Nick, when you're looking at that? And of course, the inflation burden on these people will be even greater if there is a distributional impact on this.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, yes, we do look at the composition of employment, full-time, part-time, self-employment, things like that. I think one of the most complicated things since COVID has been tax changes. I think you know more about me, IR35.
Yeah.
That's led to some very large composition shifts, people changing to one to the other. So kind of that distorts what we thought might have been an underlying change between people working in big businesses or people working for themselves. So that's one challenge that we have in interpreting those data.
Can I just say one quick thing on that? This thing about looking at size, it's like government support if you've got 5 employees or more. The move is actually less employees. We look after 18,000 businesses. We used to have 22 employees. We've now got 6 because we outsource everything. So you get somebody coming in doing the IT a couple of days a week. So that's created opportunities for others. But rather than working directly for me, they're probably working for 4 different companies doing, the IT, payroll, whatever.
Well, that's economies of scale. Of course,
Yeah,
it should, in theory, improve productivity.
But that's what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is there's more going that way with less people on the payroll. But there's still a significant 20, 30 person organisation. It's just that they're outsourcing a lot of it to other people, that community piece again.
Well, thank you. I think we probably have to leave it in. Oh, there is one question there back. Yes.
Another question, if I may, which was on your first slide, which talked about companies, and I think a number of businesses, 0 to 9 employees being 75% of the total number of businesses. I wondered if you had a number as to the size of the economy that was. And the reason why it attracted my attention was, if you speak to people that are doing the labour market stats in the UK, a lot of their surveys have as bottom limit 10 employees or 20. So none of yours will be counted. So I was just intrigued, maybe you had a measure of how much of the economy that covers.
It's number of businesses within the economy. I honestly don't know. I know that, 0 to 9. 1 to 9 is supposed to be micro businesses, and 1 to 9 is 75% of the businesses in the economy. If you bring 0 employees in as well, it pushes it up to 95. How many that is, you've got to be in the, ballpark 3-4 million, I would say.
Well, it's about 5 million companies in total,
Oh, right, so
whom
work it out from that.
only a very small fraction, I'm trying to remember the exact number, we're not talking about just tens of thousands, account for something like half of the GDP of the economy. And the rest, all this, millions of other companies account for the rest of it. So all that group again accounts for about half. That's my memory, but someone may remember that better than me. All right.
What you asked was about 12%. The 0 employee is around about 3.5% at the moment.
Oh, the 0, yes.
Something like that.
But I think you're correcting yourself anyway, that the 0 to whatever is 95%.
95.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much. If we can move to the next one, Tony, yes. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks, Vicky. I'm Tony Cox, and I chair the newly renamed Inflation Statistics User Group. It was formerly known as the RPI-CPI User Group. I'm pleased to be chairing these next couple of sessions, and we're going to start now with our second keynote speaker in a talk titled Misjudged Metrics, which will be given by Morgan Wild. Morgan Wild's been with Citizens Advice for the last 7 years or so, and he's currently head of policy there. And of course, Citizens Advice is very much at the front line of dealing with the cost of living crisis. So, Morgan.
Thank you very much, Tony, and really delighted to be here and speaking to you all today. It's been one of those afternoons where everybody else's contributions have been so interesting that I've been slightly distracted about what I'm going to say myself. But I thought I should start by saying a little bit about who I am and why I'm interested in this subject. So I think I'm the second person today who is neither a statistician or an economist. My job is to work with our 20,000 advisors up and down the country, try and make sense of the data we get from helping around 2 million people face-to-face each year, and work with the people who come to us to try and understand the problems they're facing, why they're facing them, and what needs to change. Past 18 months, that problem has been inflation. and I am now probably the third person to make a joke about their age and memories of inflation, but I too have just thought of it as some kind of fabled myth that our elders tell us about, but it's really just to scare us and to make sure we don't sleep at night. So maybe it is always this bad. But I do want to suggest some reasons why I think it is worse for the people we see this time round. So you can come to Citizens Advice with any problem you like, but we roughly think there are about 400 problems that you might come to us and need advice on. For 55 of those problems, we broke all-time records so far this year. We've been around since 1939. Outbreak of World War II. It is off the scale, as a couple of my charts will show. So I think it's worse this time. And if you look at our data, there's two things that are overwhelming. If I could have the next slide, please. One is, I think it's been obvious from others today, the cost of living crisis for our clients is primarily an energy crisis. So they've seen their bills go up by about £100 a month over the past year or two. The way that is playing out, if I could have the next slide, is people falling behind on their bills or not being able to afford energy at all. So this is, I think, probably our most heartbreaking chart at the moment. So this is the number of people who we see who have been unable to top up their prepayment meter. So literally can't turn the lights on, can't heat the home. That used to be a really small issue for us. 2019, 2020, you're talking tiny numbers of people coming to us with that problem. 2022, we saw more people with that problem than we had in the previous 10 years combined. 2023, so far, we are on track to exceed our 2022 figures by some margin. I was really struck by what Francis was saying earlier about this being a loss that we've experienced, and what matters is the distribution of that loss. And I think currently that loss is being borne by people who have the least ability to bear it. Second thing, so if I could have the next slide, that we see, this is an example of what we call a budget planner. So we do a lot of debt advice. We have people coming in the doors who are falling behind on their bills. We go through their incomes, their expenditures, their debts with really fine-tooth comb. Our debt advisors are some of the toughest people in the organisation because their job is heartbreaking in itself. It's to scrutinise in minute detail people's spending and try and get the balance right between a sustainable budget that they can live on and paying back their debts. They're strongly incentivized to do that latter bit well because we know it's the way out of financial ruin for a lot of people. This is Michelle, and she, after going through that exercise, has crossed what we call the negative budget threshold. They've got more essential spending going out than they have money coming in. This is about 50% of our debt advice clients at the moment. It's risen from about 30-ish% of people in that situation in the past 2 or 3 years. These are people who are doing everything that they can to cut back, and they're still falling behind on their bills and not able to make ends meet. So that's the picture I have been trying to make sense of at Citizens Advice. Last November, I met Jill Leyland at Cost of Living conference, and she helped me put together some of the puzzle pieces that I'm going to talk about today. Particularly, she started educating me about the household cost index and how that was a partial explanation for why things seem so much worse for our clients than the headline figures would suggest. I think those arguments will be pretty well understood by lots of people here, but just in brief, CPI is constructed by looking at every pound spent in the economy and then weighing that by shares of expenditure on different goods. Makes sense, as I understand it. Self-source on this, so you can all tell me I'm wrong. That makes a load of sense for macroeconomic purposes when you're trying to control the overall rate of inflation in the economy, but by design, it looks at the mean household rather than, say, the median household's experience of inflation, or indeed people on lower and lower incomes. So in a very practical sense, richer households' spending counts for more. That matters when different households have different expenditure shares, and poorer households will mechanically be spending a higher share on essentials like energy because their budget is smaller. And so if inflation is driven by essentials, energy, in the case for most of our clients, CPI will understate inflation for those groups. I think that helps to partly explain the first part of my puzzle. Hopefully, that is all pretty familiar. And the second bit, I think, again, sort of clear to a lot of people in the room, but it was probably the kind of weediest bit of my thinking about this and took me a while to get through. But the basic story is, well, recall Michelle. Take as given that these people are doing everything that they can to reduce their expenditure, but it is still inexorably going up. Two things clearly going on there. One, their welfare is reducing because they can afford less. Two, in economic terms, they will have very little elasticity of substitution. That expresses our willingness to substitute between two or more goods. The higher the elasticity of the substitution, the more we're willing to substitute between these goods when prices change. Should be clear, I hope, that somebody in Michelle's situation will have very, very low elasticity of substitution. They're already cutting back, they're already spending the minimum that they can. They've used buying value and brand goods at the supermarket, and they will have very little substitutional freedom to play with. Could I have the next slide? And possibly the next slide. This is just the house differential between household cost index, decile 2 and CPI over time since 2005, which the ONS has very helpfully put together. As you can see, the difference is about 5% for people on the lowest incomes, here expressed as decile 2. If I could have the next slide. Right, go back to my elasticity of substitution point. Why does this matter? Well, it matters because we only have data on spending up to a certain level of granularity. The Living Costs and Food Survey will tell us how much people are spending on apples, but it will not tell us whether people are buying Royal Galas in Cardiff or Pink Ladies in also Cardiff, I guess, other apples outside of Wales as well. So an assumption has to be made about how to calculate price changes between those two periods. CPI uses a geometric mean for these calculations. As I understand it, that's largely because it has some very pleasing mathematical properties, but the implication that it has, the crucial implication for people who come to see us, is that it implies people have an elasticity of substitution of 1. 1% increase in price implies that they will reduce their consumption by 1% of that good and increase it for the good they're substituting towards. That probably is very reasonable for me, so I like to use pasta as my go-to example here. I'm probably indifferent between very fancy pasta and Tesco Basics pasta, but so there probably isn't that much of a welfare difference for me between those two, but that's precisely the freedom of choice that the poorest households don't have. They will already be spending money on the cheapest pasta, so they have no elasticity of substitution freedom. That's a problem, both conceptually but also in practice. It means the geometric mean is used, and that is always lower than the arithmetic mean. So using it will always lead to a lower price increase. Therefore, if it will understate inflation, usually if people are already substituting. And given these people are likely to be the poorest, that could add up to a quite different inflation experience for those households. If I could have the next slide.
This is just an illustration of what those differences mean in practice. This just shows the difference between RPI arithmetic, RPI geometric. If you look before 2010, so we don't get waylaid by formula issues, that difference is about 0.4% each year, which could be a mean that the CPI is overstating inflation again for the poorest households. So that's basically my conclusion. If I can have the next slide. Cost of living crisis. It's worse than it looks. And I think it's worse than it looks because CPI has understated inflation in reasonably measurable ways. Those understatements could be systemic rather than just noise, so it could be the case that we would expect that to add up over time. And I think it matters because even if headline policy remains increasing benefits by the cost of living, in practice, each year you will end up cutting benefits in real terms. I also think it matters because it means that the official picture of benefits specifically is misleading us about poor people's incomes. So we moved to RPI, from RPI to CPI in 2010. The official picture would suggest that since then we've only cut benefits in real terms by about 6%. That's the period during the benefits freeze where we kept them at 0% rather than increasing them by CPI. And it also suggests before 2010 we were increasing benefits by above the rate of inflation. Because we were using RPI, RPI is wrong and too high, and therefore people were getting higher incomes than they should have done. And that should have given poorer households a buffer, but it's not a buffer you can see anywhere. I just don't think that is a very plausible story of what's been happening, and I think it's much more plausible that we have, by accident, by a lack of thoughtfulness from policymakers by design, reduce poorer people's real income by much more than we think. Wanted to end with a historical coda. So, very first inflation index started by looking at the inflation experience of the urban poor. It was a survey of 2,000 low-income households in cities trying to measure their essential spending. It was absolutely terrible. The Mirror called it a Whitehall flat doodle. Selfridges took big full-page ads out saying it was unscientific and unreal. But the intention behind it was very good. And I think that's my call for the statisticians in the audience, to remember your history and go back to that aim with modern methods so that we have as good a measure of inflation for the poorest in society as we do for the economy at large. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, now we come to the debate, which Morgan has actually set up very nicely in terms of the discussion about different measures of inflation, which we're going to focus on now. First up, we've got Matt Corder, who is Deputy Director for Prices and is responsible for the production of the monthly index figures that the ONS produces. Matt will be followed by Jill Leyland, who's been referred to by Morgan. She's got wide experience in official statistics, but she's also particularly important for the purposes of this afternoon. She's the co-author with John Astin, who is also present here today, of the 2015 paper Towards a Household Inflation Measure that you've heard referred to, and was seminal in leading to the development of the Household Cost Index by the ONS. Which we'll hear more about in a few moments. Our last speaker in this session is Jeff Tiley, who will present the trade union's view on the utility of inflation measures. And Jeff is the senior economist at the TUC. But first of all, Matt, over to you.
Thanks, Tony. And I think, given the time, I'm really pleased to know that Jill and I are sharing at least one slide between us. So hopefully that will help us make some more time for debate rather than long presentations. The I mean, the topic for this discussion is sort of what index should you be using? And I think the important thing I want to present as, you know, Inspector of the Office of National Statistics is it depends what question you're asking. You know, it's very much, there are many tools we provide at the ONS, and it depends on which, you know, thing you're trying to do. So we tend to think about it as a consumer prices landscape, is how we describe it. There's sort of three broad categories of measures we have. First of all is the sort of aggregate economic measures, the CPIH and the CPI, Consumer Price Index, with or without owner-occupied housing costs. And those are, you know, you're measuring what's going on in the whole economy from a macroeconomic perspective, consistent with GDP. So, for example, our headline measure is the CPIH, including owner-occupied housing costs, where we try to take account of what's happening with those who own their house, cost of managing that, in a way that's consistent with GDP, where we treat it as though they are renting their home to themselves, and that's where we calculate it. As Morgan pointed out, there's a different perspective where you actually care how individual types of households are experiencing inflation. And that's where the household cost indices come into the equation. I should say, you know, when I started at the ONS after 20 years at the Bank of England, I couldn't quite see the point of these household cost indices. You know, we had these lovely CPI and CPIH measures. Why did you need something else? But I have to say, you know, to credit to both Jill and John and others, you know, I can fully understand the value of it. And now I've sort of had more chance to reflect on the different purposes that other people have for these indices. And I think the key thing here is that, you know, we're trying to get account of both the different experiences by different types of household who have different expenditures on different types of products, as Morgan mentioned earlier, and also sort of take into account there are some ways of measuring these things that might make sense from a macroeconomics perspective, you're tying it in with GDP, that make less sense if you're trying to think about how an individual household might interpret these things. So it's things like, you talk about owner-occupied housing, we take a payments approach. You know, how much are you actually spending on your mortgage rather than what would be the equivalent value of that property if you're renting it to yourself. I put up subgroup analysis on here as well. And that's because at the moment, we've been doing a lot of work trying to develop the household cost indices, but up until now, we've only been doing it on a sort of ad hoc basis once a year or so. We are moving to bringing them out on a quarterly basis in future, so there's a more timely data, and we're working on doing that later this year. In the meantime, we're very aware that there's still an important question about, you know, how are different households experiencing inflation? Because different households do have different expenditures on different products. So the subgroup analysis we put out currently is a way of trying to bring something to the debate while we're doing that wider work. So we did put out numbers, you know, a few months back, which did point, you know, clearly show that households at lower income have experienced high inflation in recent years because much more of their expenditure is on food and energy, and that's where the biggest shocks have been. So I think there's a genuine question whether those indices are useful going forward once we have a regular household cost index, and I think that's one of the things we'll be looking to get stakeholders' views in the future. But they are there currently to make sure we're filling part of the gap in our understanding of what's going on in the world around us. The final measure is the legacy measure of the retail price index, which has a long history, but does use methods that are no longer considered world-class. You know, there's things around the calculation of the formula effect, which is not recommended by the United Nations or other bodies. We still produce it, partly because we're required to by law, but also because we know many people are required to use it. We are looking to make improvements to the series in Askworld to bring it in line with the methodology of the CPI and CPIH. We will do that from 2030, which is the soonest we are able to do that under recent consultation that government and the ONS made. But those are the three broad uses, and I think your choice of which one you do does depend on which measure you want to, what question you're trying to answer. And I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Matt. I think we'll move straight on to Jill.
Thanks very much. Right, well, I had some notes as to what to say, and having listened to other speakers, I've scribbled additional notes here, so I'll try and not, particularly what some of the things Morgan said reminded me of things to say. It's well accepted, I think, that you need different consumer price indices for different purposes. And the basic of the landscape, that you have an aggregate economic measure and a household measure is absolutely right. They are different things, and you need different methods. We've mentioned the different types of weighting, but you've also, for example, in household experience, you've got interest rates, which you wouldn't have in a macroeconomic series, and there are one or two other things as well. So let's have a quick look at go through these different series. I'm going to start with CPI, which is the EU Harmonised Index for Consumer Prices, which was, and John Astin, my partner in crime as regards the HCIs, was in fact in charge of the development of them, so knows them better than anybody else. They were developed for international comparisons and for things like inflation targeting. So it's fine for that, with one exception. The one exception, of course, is it does not include a measure of owner-occupier housing costs, because there is a method that's been decided it should be used that's consistent with the methodology used in the CPI HICP, called net acquisitions. But not all countries, I understand, are yet in a position to include this. How you measure owner-occupied housing is the most contentious issue, probably, in how you put together a consumer price index. And there are various ways. None of them are perfect. They can all be roundly criticised, but they all have different values. So it's a question of horses for courses. Back in 2010, or thereabouts, when it became clear that it was going to be a long time before the EU harmonised indices were completed, the UK decided to go ahead and produce its own version, CPIH, and that's how CPIH started. Now, the original plan or the original proposal that ONS made was, as you would expect quite logically, to use the owner-occupied, the method that the EU was going to use, net acquisitions, which was designed particularly for methods like inflation targeting. Unfortunately, the advisory committee of the day, which isn't the one that I sit on now, decided differently and used rental equivalence. Now, there's nothing wrong with rental equivalence if you use it for the right things, but it wouldn't have been acceptable to the European Central Bank, for example, as a target, because it's an imputed value. And if you're going to target inflation as your monetary policy, you presumably need real prices, or as close as you can get to them. So that's a pity. Anyway, let's go on now to household costs indices, and Morgan made the case for those very nicely. ONS has done a lot of work, and it's delightful to see that they are going to be quarterly shortly, later this year. Unfortunately, ONS has a lot of budget issues, and at the moment they're telling us that they cannot do any further development. And this, to me, seems very wrong, and I don't think I'm the only person. And I'm not going to blame Matt, that's not fair. Because I know these decisions are taken higher up the pole. So we have then HCIs, which are a lot of work has been put into, but aren't yet quite there. No more development, even though there are some things that could be quite easy to do. Now, one has to be pragmatic, and government spending has to be controlled. And there are certain things that could easily be backburnered, but there are other things that I think should not be. It doesn't, to me either, sit very well with the fact that we've got a cost of living crisis. The second point is inflation targeting is a major economic policy at the moment, but no economic policy measure lasts forever. I'm old, and I've seen in my lifetime Keynesianism and Bretton Woods, various forms of monetarism, a brief flirtation with exchange rate targeting, and then inflation targeting. That won't last forever, but the need to measure inflation as experienced by households, or as close as you can, that will remain. And the final point is, Back in March, the National Statistician gave a speech at the Royal Society about beyond GDP and the importance of having more measures that measure well-being. And there is a major conference at the beginning of July that's going to take place here on the subject of measuring well-being. So that doesn't gel with cutting the household costs indices, in my view, because that is part of well-being. I'm sorry, Matt, I didn't mean to be nasty to ONS, but there we are. I'm going to stop there because I know Jeff is going to talk about the retail prices index, so I think I'll leave that one for him.
Thanks, Nick. So just a couple of points by way of preamble. I'm going to talk a little bit about our take on the cost of living crisis more generally before I talk about the inflation measurement. And my second point by way of preamble is that I don't know whether to apologise to Frances or whether she should thank me for illustrating her point quite forcefully. Trade unions are a little tired of being told repeatedly that we have to be poorer. And the point of that slide is it's not a new thing. And of course, we are also told that getting poorer will ultimately be good for us. Certainly, we have got poorer. I could draw you a million charts. This is one of many charts I could show you comparing the present wage crisis since 2000 in purple with all others over 200 years in grey, excepting the Napoleonic Wars. It's quite a long time ago in gold. I've used the CPI here, but the catastrophe isn't contingent on any specific measure of inflation. You might forgive us for being sceptical about the payoff ever materialising. In the meantime, of course... Oh, sorry. Thanks, Lindsay. In the meantime, of course, it turned out that we weren't all in it together, as the graphic from the Conservative Manifesto in 2009 told us. Above all, the gains to wealth have been massive. I haven't had enough time to make a dramatic enough slide, but here his household net worth compared to the original OBR forecast in 2010. Unlike pretty much everything else, the wealth line has turned out greatly better than expected. And I think there's common ground here with Francis, although I reckon there's a macro dimension to it, but maybe one for afterwards. The other thing that annoys us is that we face rhetoric that is inconsistent. I don't recall warnings against excess asset inflation and the renewed bloating of finance as a threat to the stability of the system. Now, of course, they're in plain sight. In the weekend Financial Times, ex-Governor King reinforces my point when he says, for too long, institutions have been content to wait until a crisis and then deploy ad hoc measures. And that's the ex-Governor of the Bank of England. With wider commentary now focusing on greedflation, or more politely, as we've just heard, sellers' inflation, the inconsistent approach is put into even starker relief. Here's two contrasting remarks from Governor Bailey. One in March this year, when companies set prices, I understand they have to reflect the costs they face. Question, so companies have to take hit to profits. Answer, no, I am not saying that. Governor on wages a year ago was quite different. But the even odder thing here is the absence of official analysis. The monetary policy report, the latest monetary policy report, was basically empty of content on the subject of sellers' inflation. And then at the press conference, there was this bizarre moment when the governor cited this chart by Ed Conway of Sky News. So more work, yeah, if you're going to tell us this. A month or so ago, the wage price spiral debate was joined by the IMF. Their chart on the left of real wages shows how far the present world situation in red is from the wage price spiral experience of the past in the fan. On the right, incidentally, is another of their charts showing, and I quote, fiscal consolidation does not reduce debt to GDP ratios,
we should all be pretty angry about that one. In the meantime, as we've heard, we face interest rate rises of a pretty terrifying intensity, comparable, I gather, to the Volcker shock, but in conditions of prolonged stagnation. The subject I'm meant to be talking about, inflation measurement, meets this economic reality through the consequent wave of industrial actions. The statistical authorities have tried to close down the debate basically with this brute force notion of turning RPI into CPIH, but trade unions have rejected this official resolution. As you know, probably, a number of unions are choosing to illustrate their lost pay with the RPI, and this has given renewed life to the debate. As a result, what we call the school prefects have been out and about. Tim Hartford hit us with the usual hyperbole, or more or less. He said, "Oh, the RPI, oh dear, oh dear, oh dear." The retaliation from Andrew Sentence is on the slide. More or less came back to the discussion with the IFA, with the Institute for Fiscal Studies, defending the official position, but their role in calling the official position wasn't mentioned. Chris Giles from the Financial Times tried to explain the formula effect with the incorrect example of a Satsuma. Full Fact even dropped me a line, but haven't, as far as I'm aware, pursued the point. So kudos to Tony for resisting the usual groupthink and forcing the subject back onto today's agenda and into the public domain. But let's have a quick look at the state of play. Here are the differences between CPIH and CPI in maroon, CPI and RPI in blue, CPIH and RPI in grey. The latter has nearly hit 5 percentage points, and all, as far as I'm aware, as far as this is the full experience, have recently hit record levels. The components are of interest too. So on food, RPI is marginally lower. Clothing is quite interesting, with RPI so much higher than CPI and CPIH. Energy differences are relatively small, particularly given the severity of the inflation. And then owner-occupiers housing is very striking. We get CPIH at 4% and RPI at 18.6%. I've rehearsed our own arguments on this debate too many times, but here's the TUC General Council statement, which you can read at your leisure. And if you care to read our arguments in more detail, there's a minority report attached to the stakeholder panel report that the link's there, but I'm sure Tony will share it. I would just make one final general comment about bamboozling us with economic science. On this, I think the owner-occupiers housing measure is instructive. It's hard in the face of monetary tightening to tell us that the right answer, according to your preferred and allegedly theoretical sound measure, is only 4%. Likewise, the case for the use of only Jevons, as we also heard from Morgan, is contestable. And I do note that the official argument has flip-flopped. At the theoretical level, we were originally, the argument was all around substitution theory, but that was kind of ditched to talk about axiomatic arguments. We should remind ourselves that the issue first came to prominence because the CPI was too low, not because the RPI was too high. And likewise, as someone else has said further back, the banning of the Carley method was for comparability and macro purposes, not because it was right. And for me, the argument should be, or it should have been, and maybe should still be, both empirical and theoretical, which was once the ONS approach, with a work programme that proceeded on a case-by-case basis. The next slide, please. Maybe the economic science, I'm not going to ask the questions, but maybe the economic science has hit a new peak with the GEKS Tornqvist formula, which will apparently resolve the elementary aggregate issue. So I guess my closing thought is I wonder if the solution isn't so wholly technocratic. It's for something that makes sense to people and corresponds to their experience. And maybe your task will be easier if it's not yet another mechanism that makes us poorer. Thank you.
Thanks to all our speakers this afternoon, and indeed for the whole afternoon. I note that, just in passing about the formula, Matt has very kindly, on behalf of the ONS, undertaken to explain this formula to us at some point in the future.
He's stitching him up.
And we're all looking forward to that, I can tell you. I'm struck by the way that a number of our speakers have referred back to the point that was made by our first keynote speaker this afternoon in terms of the distribution effects. And of course, this last session has been talking very much about the tools we use to assess what's going on in the real economy and the importance of getting those tools right so that our policymakers can use them appropriately. And of course, that's another leap to hope that they will do that. But are there any questions from the floor? And whilst I'm taking questions, I should just issue an apology to those people who are online, who I understand we cannot, for technical reasons, take your questions, but hopefully they'll be covered by those people in the room. First of all, yep.
Is there any international process for defining inflation in the way that there is for GDP to be set?
I didn't quite hear that. Can you...
As I understand it, is there any international process for determining?
International or multilateral process like with the OECD or the UN in defining or reviewing or categorising
There's been a lot of work ever since, or certainly since the Second World War. It was pioneered by the International Labour Office because consumer price indices originally, their main purpose was for use in wage negotiations. Now it's all the major international things have it. There are conferences, two sets of international conferences that occur every 2 or 3 years. One's the Ottawa Group and the other one is by the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, which John and I are actually presenting at the next one in June. And there is an international manual which provides a lot of technical advice. Quite often the conclusion is, if you want this, you do A, and if you want that, you do B. It's not, you must do C. That's fair enough, I think.
John, do you want to add to that?
CPI. As Joe mentioned, this was developed under my tutelage at Eurostat back in the 1990s, and it was called the HRCB, the Harmonised Index of Consumer Prices, which it is still called, and it still exists. And I personally was very delighted, of course, when the Bank of England took it over, even if the change were made. But don't forget that the methodology of the HRCB is under the control of the EU, which UK no longer belongs to. So I think, so it seems to be a slightly dangerous thing for the Bank of England to continue it, and not knowing what it's going to change to, because it will be changing. It's been going for 25 years, and I think the next step will be bringing government-occupied housing into it, which may not be the right step for the bank. I don't know. It is a bit of a threat.
Do you want to respond?
The one thing I was going to say on that is, you're right, there's methodologies sort of the HICP sort of thing for Eurostat. At the ONS we have the NSK, so I'm trying to remember what it actually means. We have an advisory group that advises the national statistician on to what international standards we do or don't go on. So there's nothing automatic about any decision about the HICP at the Eurostat level that it would apply to the UK. That would be a decision for the national statistician.
Okay. Sean at the back and then Tony.
I have a question please that links what Matt said with Morgan, because Matt said to us that each of the inflation measures had a purpose. And if we look at back to Morgan's speech, we say that CPI anticipates inflation for those in difficulties at lower levels. As CPI H is a lower number than CPI, then that's worse. So what purpose does it serve other than giving a lower number?
As we discussed, as Jill said, there's many differences of opinion on what the appropriate measure when occupied housing is. As I said, it's The measure we have taken is based on the advice at the panel, of the technical panel at the time, and is consistent with the methodology used in GDP. There are different ways of measuring housing costs, none of which are perfect, as Jill said. At least what we have is consistent with the GDP measure, and that's also why we're working on HCIs, which has a different measure of calculating occupied housing costs. And as I said before, you can take the measure you prefer. It is true that there's some, with rents tending to move less quickly than headline inflation recently, then it is lower. That's not a guaranteed statement.
Okay, Tony.
Can I just say that I'm very conscious of the time, and I think we should really get on with it. It seems to be pretty well set up for a little discussion of the politics of inflation, and I appreciate what everyone's done. Please, if that's all right, Chairman.
Okay.
I would like to say one thing about the ONS. As far as I know, the 2007 paper doesn't mention anything about the requirement to match international standards. It's just that our statistics have been to be for the public good of the United Kingdom. And I'm not necessarily sure. Thank you.
Oh, I was going to say,
no.
It's more the fact that we take into account international standards when deciding what's the best practice when using our statistics. As I said, there's an advisory panel to advise financial statistics on the best approach.
Okay.
We're still on.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. Are there any last minute questions? I take it Tony would like us to move on to our next speaker, who's well known to us all. So, okay, then thank you to the panel.
Okay, first of all, I think perhaps we should say thank you very much to our virtual audience for their attention throughout the afternoon. And thank you for their continuing interest, because it's clearly important that an event like this is as available as possible to the maximum possible audience. One of the leitmotifs of the afternoon has been a generational divide. There are those of us, in which I have to include myself, who do remember inflation, and there are those of us for whom it's come as a bit of a shock. And part of what I want to do this afternoon, and in a sense what it's kind of resting on, is to do a little bit of fairly top-level comparison of the politics of inflation in the 1970s with the politics of inflation now. Looking in particular at the role of inflation itself on the standing of governments, but also looking in particular much more directly at one of those issues that's been circulating around today's debate, which is the impact on living standards in particular, but also to look at one of the manifestations or potential consequences of inflation. We've talked a lot about potential wage price spirals. Well, wage price spirals in part are a reflection of the bargaining power of labour, and that in part is to do with their ability to engage in industrial action that might be able to force up the price of labour. So, and that of course was crucial to the 1970s. So that's what I'm roughly going to do. Can we go to the first slide, please? So for those of you who do not remember, this is how bad it was. And it is worth remembering, I think this is CPI. It is worth remembering, you might think that 10% was bad, but some of us can remember 25%, okay? So it is worth bearing in mind that the inflation that we have suffered so far is A, much more short term, so far, but B, also has not as yet at least hit a peak at anything like the kind of level that we experienced in the 1970s, not least in the wake of the oil price shock. It was oil back in the 1970s, and it's energy now that's been responsible for a lot of what's happened. So I note, hang on to that 1975, it's quite important what I've got to say. Note also, however, of course, some of you, again, you won't remember
strikes. You know, once upon a time, strikes were quite common, and maybe for some of you, the last few months have also been a novel experience. Well, if we could go to the next slide, please. Strikes were definitely a feature of the inflation of the 1970s, and of course, most notably, in what we have come to know as the winter of discontent, which is the winter of 1978 to 1979, when the government's attempts to keep wage inflation down were finally being overhauled by very substantial, particularly public sector industrial strife. Okay, next slide, please. So, with that very, very, very quick history to the 1970s, what happened to government popularity? So red is Labour, and just in case you don't remember, Labour were in charge between 1974 and 1979. So when the blue line is above the red line, it means the Conservatives were ahead. Well, the first thing to note is that actually when inflation was at its height, Conservative and Labour were pretty close to each other. So directly, at least, I suppose perhaps some of its indirect consequences, inflation didn't particularly have that much impact on the popularity of the government, although, of course, we have to bear in mind that the government came to power in back in February 1974 already, when I've shown you that inflation was on the high side. The second thing you will note is on the far right-hand side is that during the winter of discontent, basically the popularity of the then Labour administration took a bit of a nosedive. So the winter of discontent definitely had quite substantial impacts on the popularity of the government. But the third thing that you will note is that the point in which the Labour government first hit trouble is, as I said, after the height of the inflationary spike, but it's basically after the IMF crisis of 1976, when the government was forced to at least arrange a bailout from the IMF, although I think in truth, doubtless somebody in this room will correct me if I'm wrong, in the end we never actually had to use the money, but we needed to convince the markets that the money was there if we had needed to do it. So therefore, bear in mind, so there are three things about the 1970s I want to hang on to. One is the level of inflation. The second is one of the things that manifested that is people went through the processes that Francis was talking about at the beginning, which was the labour market disputes. And the third is that in the middle of all this, there was a wee bit of a fiscal crisis. You can see where I'm going, I suspect. Anyway, let's go to the next slide, please. So this is actually the history of inflation on CPI as we've more recently experienced. And I suppose one of the things it's worth bearing in mind, and I'm not quite sure whether we've always got the tenor of this afternoon, if you look at the data on, what do people think is the most important issue facing the country, it's really only in the summer of last year that inflation really begins to hit the public consciousness, and that's around the time when it also became central to our political debate. But actually, inflation was rising well before then. It really goes back to the end of the first phase of the COVID pandemic, but actually is already happening when we were still going through the second phase thereof. So it's been with us now for quite a while, but it's only much more recently that it's become central to our political debate. Anyway, next slide, please. This is straight from OBR, if OBR is still here. But this is both the record of and forecasts of living standards. And it's the one on the left-hand side that's the interesting one. It goes back to 1956. And of course, if you're familiar with what OBR have been saying, the really important thing about the current inflation, which even distinguished it from the inflation of the 1970s, is that we are heading for the biggest fall in living standards since this was measured back in 1956. So the red bars show you, when it was negative. So there's a little bit of negativity in the 1970s, but just look, not necessarily what's happened, but what is expected to happen over the ensuing period. And you can see on the right-hand side here again how it changed between March and November. Now, against this backdrop, it frankly is not surprising that we've seen quite a lot of the way of labour market disputes, because basically we are all, as Francis said, suffering loss. And much as in the 1970s, the reaction of the union movement, unsurprisingly, has been to try to reverse that. And of course, it's in the public sector where the unions are still at least relatively strong, and it's in the public sector where the wage rates have been rising least strongly. But interestingly, next slide, please. Despite the disruption, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment, of course, what's perhaps also made this rather more difficult for the government is that quite a lot of the sectors that have been in dispute in recent months are pretty popular with the public, and the public have largely backed those strikes, and particularly those inside the health service. I didn't put the driving examiners on here. The group that's always come at the bottom of these league tables have always been the driving examiners. What we've got against driving examiners, I do not possibly understand. After all, they do allow us to drive, even if the process by which we get there is a somewhat painful one. So against this backdrop, you might think, well, we've got an even bigger standard of living crisis than we had in the 1970s. We've got public sector unions which have quite widespread sympathy, at least for some sectors, and even some of the less popular sectors, they're not that unpopular. Yet, next slide, the days lost to strikes, well, yes, it matches 1976, but it's been nothing like 1979, or 1974, or 1975, or 1978. And I think one of the things we've not talked about this afternoon is indeed, of course, is that both the legal framework within which trade unions are operating and perhaps also the financial framework within they're operating, yes, we've had one-day strikes, and that's what we've had. We should remember in the winter of discontent, we had all-out strikes for extended periods of time. And the trade unions, rightly or wrongly, for the most part, not engaged in that kind of activity. Strikes in this era have almost been an instrument of publicity. Well, if you go out for strike for a day, you're guaranteed that the Today programme and Sky News will haul you on, and you can make your case. But frankly, it's not worth doing the strike beyond day 3, because by that point they will lose interest. And the truth is that unions don't seem to are not in a position to get their members out indefinitely. That requires a lot in terms of financial muscle by the unions, etc., etc. So the truth is that I think perhaps one of the things we have to say about this era is that we have indeed perhaps now reaped, whether you regard it as the reward or the costs of the change in the legal position of trade unions and the declining strength of trade unions, has been very clearly manifested actually during this so-called repeat of the winter of discontent. It wasn't a repeat of the winter of discontent. Now, next slide. Of course, the interesting question, therefore, is what are the consequences of this? Now, I noticed in the previous presentation a slide, which is probably a much better one than the one I've got here. This is just taking one of the settlements, which is the settlement, quote unquote, for the nurses and other health workers. And this has been worked out by the King's Fund. And essentially the message is that although in the short run, i.e. if you take into account the consolidated payments, the health workers have kind of just about caught up. But once those, because of the lack of consolidation, they are fairly rapidly heading in a direction whereby they're still not going to be, in any sense, catching up with the implications of inflation. I've read one or two things about some of the others. I think that's probably also true of the others, but certainly the slide you showed earlier about the way in which wages were not keeping up with inflation as compared with previous inflationary spirals, I think, again, perhaps indicates that this is true. So despite the sympathy for the strikers, despite this being a more serious standard of living crisis, the trade union movement, so far at least, has not been particularly effective, question mark, or at least they've had some effect, but perhaps not as effective as they would like to be at getting wages catching up with the inflationary spiral. Next slide, please. And certainly what's also been true, and I'll show you some more of this kind of in a moment, is the way in which, in sharp contrast to the Labour government in 1978 to 1979, essentially has survived the strikes of recent weeks, relatively unscathed. I mean, the popularity of neither the government nor the Prime Minister has increased during the course of recent weeks, but it's not plummeted in the way that it did in 1978 to 1979. So again, so far, as it were, relatively good news for the government. But of course, there's going to be a but. Let's move on to the next slide. It's worth being aware again, going back to what I said earlier about how inflation has actually been with us for a while. Indeed, the public were becoming economically pessimistic well before Ukraine, and that earlier inflation was already being reflected in people being more likely to be pessimistic than optimistic about the future of the economy, even though we were coming out of the pandemic. And of course, governments tend to be rewarded if people think that things are going to get better, and they tend to lose out if they think that things are going to get worse. Next slide, please. And that's certainly true, one of the problems facing the current government politically. This is from 12 months ago, because it's the most recent data I can get my hands on, but I doubt if anything's changed. So again, this is now taking those people who voted Conservative in 2019 and looking at their probability of saying that they will vote Conservative again, separately for, first of all, those on the left-hand side who think that the economy will either be at least the same in 12 months' time as it is now, or maybe even better. They are, by the way, a decided minority. In the middle, those who think the economy will get a little worse. And yes, on the right-hand side are those who think the economy is going to get a lot worse. Now, one thing to say is that even amongst those who are optimistic about the economy, minorities they are, the government is also losing votes, but it's losing votes for other obvious reasons, like Boris Johnson. But equally, however, you can see how economic pessimism amongst Conservative voters is something that is certainly seriously eroding the government's position. But it isn't just about that. Next slide, please. Here is a look at perceptions of the government's economic competence. It's not economic confidence, this is perceptions of the government's economic competence. Blue means well, I think they're doing well. Red means they're doing badly. And this goes all the way back to 2016. And as you can see, well into 2021, particularly as the vaccine was coming on stream, etc., etc. Percentage of people thought the economy was being handled well, matches those badly. Now, already the case that perceptions of the government's economic competence began to decline during the course of 2021, early 2022. But yeah, you've guessed it, there's a little wee spike there, isn't there? No prizes for working out what that is. That's Liz Truss. And you can see how, although to some degree it's been ameliorated, the impact of Liz Truss has not as yet clearly been washed out. Which takes me to my penultimate slide, you'll be pleased to hear. So let's then look at the trajectory of support for the government since December 2019. 2 years, superb record, no sign of midterm blues, a government that seemed to defy electoral gravity, and then on came Partygate, etc. But notice that, sure, there's the hit to the government through Partygate, declining economic confidence in late 21, early 2022. But when it comes to the government losing popularity, it's the Truss spike that really, really matters, and then once you look at this, it's from which the government has not recovered. So, next slide, please, which is the last one. Sure, inflation matters. And I think certainly this inflationary spiral has been markedly different from that of the 1970s. A, in terms of its impact on living standards, or was expected to be, but B, despite that, the way in which wages have, the attempt to get wages to keep up with them has proven to be much more difficult, and equally also the way in which the government politically has been able to ride out labour market unrest. But that doesn't mean to say that this government can escape the broader concern about economic confidence and about living standards. But above all, much as was the problem for the Labour government in the 1970s was the IMF crisis. The fundamental problem facing this government is not so much the real economy, but the perceived economy of the Liz Truss fiscal event. And to that extent, at least, the real question is whether or not the government can, between now and towards the end of next year, persuade the public to forget that searing event. But we also have to remember that no government that presided over a fiscal or a financial crisis has managed to survive at the ballot box thereafter. So it's a very, very substantial that the government challenge faces.
Thank you very much, Sean. I'm intrigued by that reminder that perhaps inflation doesn't really matter, it's just economic competence in general.
I thought you'd appreciate that message at the end of a conference on inflation.
Inflation, quite. That's a really startlingly good conference in every shape or form. Thank you very much for the start. Yes, Vicky, you have some questions, of course.
Going back to inflation, I'm afraid. So economic competence is a mix of all sorts of things.
Sure.
But are you saying that when you look at whatever comes into this, I presume there must be a series of questions that are being asked, or is it just one question?
There is simple questions, yeah, sure.
Series of questions. Inflation is there somewhere, or living standards are there somewhere.
Yeah, sure.
Interest rates are there somewhere, and we wouldn't have such high interest rates if we hadn't had that inflation, or at least the bank would react to this. So I was just trying to disentangle it a little bit, just to save our conference, because that was the point of having this great conference.
But I think the point is, insofar as the Liz Truss fiscal event is one of the well, it wasn't an inevitable consequence, but it ended up being a consequence of the Conservative Party's perceptions of the economic circumstances in which we found ourselves in the wake of Ukraine, in the wake of the COVID pandemic, of which inflation is another consequence. Then sure, these things are not unconnected to each other. Clearly not. But I think the point I'm making is that it's not the statistics on their own that matters. It's the way in which they get dramatised. And the point is, again, in the 1970s, the issue of inflation, in a sense, got dramatised, A, by the IMF crisis, and B, by the winter of discontent. This time it's been dramatised by the Liz Truss event, and it's only when the drama kicks in that you get dramatic shifts in government popularity, as opposed to the kind of gradual erosion that we were seeing the government's position basically through to Liz Truss's short tenure as Prime Minister.
I think also trying to learn from our public work, which opinion we're good enough to support us on, there is, in fact, amongst the public, a lack of understanding of information, of who measures it, who really is responsible for it. In every sense, they don't necessarily associate even their direct well-being with inflation as caused by the government. It's not necessarily a direct relationship at all. They're trying to find out or understand more about that. But I think it's made a major contribution.
Now, what people will understand, as we were talking about earlier this afternoon, is things are costing more than I can afford.
Yeah, that's they're not sure who's really responsible for that fact.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, but they're not going to read the inflation statistics. They will say, I can no longer afford to, pay for the school trips for my child, or I can no longer afford my rent, or I'm at threat of eviction. I mean, that's when people will.
Can I quickly stop there? If the forecast of inflation that we have seen,
yeah.
so I'm correct, by the end of 2024 we're back to target, or some measurements even less. How will that change?
Oh, sorry. Can we go back to my living standard slide? Yeah, right. I mean, it's what we have to remember here, right? Even if the Prime Minister hits his target, I want to go back to the one that has the OBR in inflation living standards one. So the point is, even if the Prime Minister is successful at halving the rate at which prices are increasing, right? Okay. But as a result, even in the, unless wages start to increase more rapidly than prices, we are all going to be worse off in the autumn of next year than we probably are at the moment, and we certainly were 12 months ago. Right? You know, we will simply stop. The rate at which we begin to feel poorer and poorer will simply decline. It will only be reversed if either we get deflation, and that obviously has other potential consequences, or we get to a position where wages are starting to overtake prices. But I'm kind of indicating that, you know, perhaps one of the reasons why these figures for living standards in the short run are right, you know, apart from the arguments earlier about, you know, is it business that's causing inflation, is that it seems unlikely that on the evidence so far that workers are going to succeed in the short run, at least, in catching up the losses that they're suffering. And I see even the TUC are willing to admit that that seems to be a reasonable argument.
I was going to ask before you mentioned it, that his policy, his number one goal is halving the risk of inflation.
Yeah.
With the fact that his number one goal is kind of bizarre, isn't it? Because that just says that your thing, sort of whatever you're buying, is still much more expensive.
Yeah, sure. No, absolutely. Absolutely.
I mean, I thought we had a striking fact today, actually, the dramatising was that the company was cancelled, just mentioned that it's now turns out that people can't afford to give to food banks.
Sure.
That's today's fact. We don't see that. Just one little tangible way of
Sure.
Final question.
Yeah, something that struck me actually in relation to this slide and your slides about the power of unions in the 1970s, which I will remember, is that in a way the corollary to the decline of union power and indeed the decline of the worker power, it's not just unions, the bargaining power of workers generally is much less than it was.
Absolutely.
And the other side of that, which kind of relates to what we were talking about earlier,
Yeah.
is surely that the bargaining power of firms and government as employer is much stronger. And, you know, in the words of Thucydides,
Yeah.
the strong do what they can.
Yeah.
And the weak suffer what
Yeah,
they
and the bargaining power is weaker, even though we've got a very tight labour market.
Yeah.
Right.
It's the cost of living crisis.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
fact- The fact that we have a very tight labour market is still not really driving up wages in the way that it would have done
Yeah.
in the 1970s.
Yeah, yeah, exactly so. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm very conscious that we've had a lot of people working overtime. Thank you. The young ladies moved all the slides on so well for us. Thank you. Thank you all. In the next conference, I just like to say that we have recently set up forums, and we'd really appreciate it if we could carry on with this debate. Write to everybody about how they can contribute to the debate about inflation and tax. I would really like to see us try to carry that on through our new forum. And I apologise to all those who've been with us by teams that we don't allow questions. It's difficult enough to organise ourselves just in the room. But look through carefully whatever questions have been asked, and invite you also to join the forum and carry discussion on. Thank you all very much for your time, especially our speakers. It's very good.